I can still hear the sound of it, the crack of helmets colliding, the gasp of a stadium not sure if it had just witnessed brilliance or brutality. The 1970s were the decade when football changed, when the NFL grew from a popular sport into a national obsession. And at the heart of it all was a rivalry that transcended the boundaries of the game: Pittsburgh versus Oakland. The Steelers and the Raiders. Two teams, two cities, two cultures that seemed destined to clash not just on the field, but in the very identity of the league itself. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was not built on friendly competition or the respect of equals. It was born in blood, in bruises, in games so violent that even seasoned players admitted they feared for their lives. When the Raiders lined up against the Steelers, it wasn't just football. It was a collision of philosophy, of style, of pride. And the echoes of those collisions stretched far beyond Sunday afternoons. The Steelers of the 1970s were iron and grit. They carried the identity of a city forged in steel mills, a team built on defense, intimidation, and raw power. They called it the Steel Curtain, and names like Jack Lambert, Mean Joe Green, Mel Blount, and Jack Ham still strike a chord of reverence in football history. They played with a ferocity that mirrored the toughness of Pittsburgh itself. The Raiders were something different. Al Davis had crafted a team in his own image. Rebellious, menacing, unapologetic. Just win, baby, wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life. Their silver and black uniforms were more than colors. They were symbols of defiance. John Madden's Raiders were notorious for playing past the whistle, for intimidating opponents, for embracing the label of the NFL's villains. When those two forces met, the results were explosive. From 1972 through 1976, the Steelers and Raiders clashed in the playoffs 5 straight years. No two teams had ever collided with such regularity at the game's highest stakes, and no two fan bases loathed each other with more venom. These games were wars, and the wounds did not heal once the stadium emptied. The story begins with one of the most iconic and controversial plays in NFL history: the Immaculate Reception. December 23, 1972. The Raiders and Steelers were locked in a low-scoring, brutal playoff battle at Three Rivers Stadium. With just 22 seconds left and the Steelers trailing 7-6, Terry Bradshaw hurled a desperate pass. The ball ricocheted, and somehow Franco Harris scooped it from inches above the turf, sprinting into the end zone for the winning score. Pittsburgh erupted in joy. Oakland seethed in outrage. To this day, Raiders players insist the ball hit the ground, that it should have been ruled incomplete. John Madden later admitted that play haunted us. It still does. It was like being robbed in broad daylight. The bitterness festered. The Raiders carried it into every meeting that followed, using it as fuel, using it as justification for their anger. The years that followed only deepened the hostility. In the 1973 AFC playoffs, Oakland struck back, dismantling the Steelers in a punishing victory. The next season, Pittsburgh returned the favor, winning 24-13 on their way to the first Super Bowl in franchise history. Each year, one stood in the way of the other, and with each clash, the hits grew harder, the tempers shorter, the grudges deeper. Jack Tatum, the Raiders safety known as the Assassin, became the embodiment of Oakland's ruthlessness. His hits were devastating, sometimes life-altering. The Steelers despised him. Franco Harris once said, "When you played the Raiders, you didn't just prepare for football, you prepared for survival." The violence was not confined to the field. Players refused to shake hands. Teams accused each other of cheap shots, of bending the rules, of outright attempts to injure. Reporters described the atmosphere around these games as poisonous. By 1975, the Steelers had claimed back-to-back Super Bowls, each time stepping over Oakland to get there. The Raiders burned with resentment. Their turn came in 1976. That season, they went 13-1, storming into the playoffs determined to end Pittsburgh's reign. When the two teams met in the AFC Championship, Oakland delivered its most decisive blow, a 24-7 victory that sent them to their first Super Bowl title. After the game, Raiders linebacker Phil Villapiano declared, "We finally killed the monster." But even then, the hatred lingered. These weren't just football games, they were battles that defined careers. Terry Bradshaw admitted years later that playing the Raiders took years off his life. Jack Lambert reveled in the blood feud, saying, "You could hate them all week and feel good about it." This was more than competition. It was psychological warfare. Each side carried scars that went beyond broken bones and concussions. The animosity spilled into press conferences, into the offseason, into the personal relationships of men who could not let go of what had been done to them on the field. But what makes this rivalry chilling is not just the hits or the hatred. It is what it revealed about the NFL itself. The league sold these matchups as entertainment, as gladiatorial clashes, as spectacles of toughness. But for the men who lived it, the cost was staggering. Bodies broken, friendships destroyed, careers shortened, and a legacy of bitterness that endures even decades later. Rivalries like this didn't just shape who won Super Bowls, they shaped who these men became. How they were remembered, and in some cases, how they suffered long after the final whistle. The Steelers and Raiders of the 1970s were not alone. The NFL is built on rivalries, and with each era came new battles that transcended the field. The Cowboys and the 49ers fought for the right to define America's team in the 1990s. Peyton Manning and Tom Brady waged a decade-long duel not only for championships, but for history itself. Brett Favre turned his back on Green Bay and became the enemy within his own family of fans. Rivalries stretch across cities, across generations, across legacies. What makes them endure is the way they go beyond the scoreboard. Rivalries become part of culture, part of memory, part of identity. They outlive the players, outlive the games, outlive even the men who built them. And yet, at the heart of every rivalry are human beings, men with pride. Men with anger, men with fear that carried those battles into their lives off the field. That is the dark side of football's fiercest rivalries. They are not always celebrations of greatness. Sometimes they are wounds that never close. And that is the journey we are about to take. From the blood feuds of the 1970s to the dynastic wars of the 1990s, to the quarterback duels that defined the modern NFL. This is the hidden history of the league's toughest rivalries. When legends collided off the field and the consequences lasted far longer than 4 quarters. Rivalries are the lifeblood of sport. They give games meaning beyond the scoreboard, infusing every snap with history, pride, and the memory of past battles. In the National Football League, rivalries are not just a feature of the game, they are part of its DNA. From the earliest days of leather, helmets to the billion-dollar spectacles of modern Super Bowls. The NFL has been defined as much by who teams fought against as by what they achieved. But unlike rivalries in other sports, footballs are unique and often darker. They do not stay neatly confined between the sidelines. They seep into the identities of cities, the reputations of players, and the culture of the league itself. When we talk about rivalries in the NFL, we are not talking about friendly competition. We are talking about bitterness that spans decades, grudges that harden into folklore, and battles so violent they reshape the rules of the sport. At times, rivalries have lifted football into myth, producing unforgettable moments and legendary clashes. At other times, they have left behind bitterness, broken bodies, and stories that remind us how thin the line between passion and hatred can be. The first rivalries in the NFL were not born out of television ratings or media hype. They were born out of survival. In the 1920s and 1930s, the league was still fragile, fighting for attention against baseball, boxing, and college football. Teams needed loyalty, identity, and stories to draw fans. The Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers gave them that. Their rivalry, stretching back more than a century, is the oldest and most enduring in the league. George Hella says Bears and Curly Lambeau's Packers weren't just playing football. They were competing for the heart of the Midwest. The games were brutal, often violent, beyond what the rules allowed. And they established a template. Rivalries would define the NFL. As the decades passed, rivalries evolved alongside the league. In the 1950s and 1960s, as television began to transform football into a national pastime, new rivalries captured the imagination. The Giants and the Eagles clashed in wars that reflected the toughness of the Northeast. The Browns and the Steelers fought for blue-collar supremacy along the Rust Belt. By the late 1960s, as the Super Bowl era dawned, rivalries became the stage on which legends were forged. Vince Lombardi's Packers squared off against Tom Landry's S. Cowboys in iconic games like the Ice Bowl of 1967, contests that still echo in the mythology of the sport. But the rivalries that truly revealed football's darker edges emerged in the 1970s. That was the decade when the game's violence became both its selling point and its shadow. The Steelers and the Raiders embodied this truth more than anyone. Their clashes were not just about football, they were about identity. Pittsburgh's blue-collar toughness against Oakland's outlaw swagger. 5 straight playoff meetings between 1972 and 1976 etched their names into history, but also left players with grudges that lasted lifetimes. Jack Tatum's devastating hit on Darryl Ice Stingley in 1978, not against the Steelers, became a symbol of the era. S brutality and cemented his reputation as the embodiment of Oakland's ruthlessness. To this day, veterans from both sides speak about those games less as sporting contests and more as wars they barely survived. In the 1980s and 1990s, rivalries shifted toward dynasties and legacies. The Cowboys and the 49ers fought to define an era of dominance, clashing in the NFC Championship again and again. These games weren't just about reaching the Super Bowl. They were about deciding which team would embody excellence for a generation. Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin on one side. Joe Montana, Steve Young, and Jerry Rice on the other. Every matchup felt like a clash of titans, and every outcome reshaped the league's balance of power. Off the field, these rivalries played out in endorsements, media coverage, and the shaping of each franchise's brand. The Cowboys were America's team, the face of mainstream success. The 49ers were innovators, West Coast's brilliance and style matched with substance. Then came the quarterback duels that defined the modern era. Peyton Manning and Tom Brady were the personification of rivalry at the highest level. 1. The golden son of football royalty, groomed from childhood for greatness. The other, the overlooked 6th-round pick, dismissed by scouts, fueled by perpetual resentment. They faced each other more than a dozen times, each game a referendum not just on their teams, but on their very legacies. Brady's Patriots became the league's dynasty, while Manning chased, always chasing, determined to prove that genius and precision could triumph over cold, relentless efficiency. For nearly 2 decades, their rivalry anchored the NFL's identity. Fans didn't just ask who would win the Super Bowl, they asked who would win when Brady and Manning collided. But what makes these rivalries matter? What makes them worthy of exploration in this story is not just the on-field drama. It is what happened off the field. Rivalries shaped how players saw themselves, how fans defined their cities, how coaches built careers. They spilled into personal lives, friendships, and the very fabric of communities. When Brett Favre left Green Bay and joined the Minnesota Vikings, it wasn't just a roster move. It was a betrayal that ripped at the soul of Wisconsin. When Terrell Owens celebrated on the Dallas Star in the early 2000s, it wasn't just a touchdown, it was a declaration of war on a franchise's pride. Rivalries have also revealed the NFL's willingness to exploit conflict. The league has long understood that fans crave drama, and nothing sells drama like hate. Television networks, sports writers, and league officials amplified rivalries, turning them into narratives that drove ratings and revenue. Cowboys versus 49ers in the 1990s wasn't just football, was primetime theater. Manning versus Brady wasn't just two quarterbacks sit, was the defining storyline of an era. Rivalries became products, and in that transformation, they often demanded more from players than the game itself. Still, the dark side of rivalries is not only about violence or media exploitation. It is about the personal cost. Rivalries push players beyond the edge of reason. They invite grudges that last careers, sometimes lifetimes. They fracture locker rooms as teammates become competitors within their own ranks. The Montana Young saga in San Francisco is a perfect example. Here was a dynasty, 4 Super Bowls already in hand, and yet the rivalry between two quarterbacks nearly tore it apart. Joe Montana admitted he never felt safe, always looking over his shoulder, while Steve Young struggled for years to escape the shadow of a legend. Their rivalry didn't just define games, it defined identities. As we trace the story of the NFL's toughest rivalries, we will move through eras and explore clashes that reshaped the league. We will revisit the century-old war between the Bears and Packers, still burning after more than 200 meetings. We will relive the blood feuds of the 1970s, when the Steelers and Raiders left permanent scars on one another. We will travel through the dynastic wars of the 1990s, when Cowboys and 49ers traded blows for supremacy. We will dissect the quarterback duels of the modern era, when Brady and Manning carried the weight of legacy on every throw. And we will expose the rivalries that lived within teams, tearing apart dynasties from the inside. This is not a celebration of highlight reels. It is not a retelling of sports. This is an examination of how rivalries shape men, cities, and the league itself. It is a story of pride and hatred, of loyalty and betrayal, of how competition can both elevate and destroy. Rivalries are the engine of the NFL's mythology, but they are also its shadow, the part of the game that reveals as much about human nature as it does about sport. So as we begin this journey, remember, every great rivalry is more than a contest. It is a story that extends beyond the field, a conflict that lives in the spaces between the games. These are the tales of grudges carried for decades, of men defined as much by their enemies as by their triumphs, of legends who collided not just in stadiums, but in every corner of their lives. This is the NFL's toughest rivalries, when legends collided off the field. I remember the first time I heard the phrase, the Immaculate Reception. It didn't sound like football. It sounded like something out of Scripture, something larger than life. Even today, more than 50 years later, it carries a weight that no ordinary touchdown ever could. On December 23, 1972, in a frigid playoff game in Pittsburgh, Franco Harris bent history with his fingertips, scooping a deflected ball just before it struck the turf, racing into the end zone as the stadium erupted in chaos. The play didn't just save the Steelers' season. It marked the beginning of their dynasty. But miracles for one side often mean heartbreak for the other. And for the Oakland Raiders, that moment wasn't divine, it was theft. The controversy began instantly. Raiders safety Jack Tatum had collided with Pittsburgh's Frenchie Fuqua, sending the ball ricocheting into the air. Harris caught it, but under the rules of the day, if Fuqua had touched the ball first, the play should have been ruled dead. Raiders coach John Madden stormed the sideline. Players screamed at officials. Madden insisted Harris's catch violated the rule, but the referees allowed it to stand. The Steelers advanced, the Raiders went home, and the seeds of one of football's fiercest rivalries were planted in anger and disbelief. This was no ordinary rivalry. It was a collision of cultures, identities, and philosophies. The Steelers reflected Pittsburgh itself, gritty, industrial, blue-collar. They played as if forged from the steel mills that surrounded the city. The Raiders, by contrast, embodied Oakland's edge. They were outlaws, renegades, a team that wore defiance like a second uniform. They relished intimidation, and their reputation for ferocity was not undeserved. On the surface, these two teams represented different archetypes, but beneath it, they were cut from the same cloth. Violent, uncompromising, and committed to breaking the other's will. When their paths crossed in the 1970s, the results weren't just competitive, they were explosive. From 1972 to 1976, the Steelers and Raiders met in the playoffs 5 consecutive years. No other rivalry in NFL history has matched that streak of postseason collisions. Each game carried not just the weight of championships, but of grudges sharpened from the year before. Players admitted openly that these games were not about mutual respect, they were about hatred. Jack Lambert, the snarling Steelers linebacker, once confessed, "If I had to play football for fun, I'd quit." For Lambert, football was about punishment. Against the Raiders, it was personal. On the other side, Gene Upshaw, Hall of Fame guard for Oakland, remembered those years with blunt honesty. They wanted to destroy you, and we wanted to destroy them. This wasn't the rhetoric of rivalry, it was the reality of survival. The animosity spilled beyond the field. In 1976, Raiders defensive back George Atkinson delivered a brutal helmet-to-helmet hit on Steelers receiver Lynn Swann. The collision left Swann unconscious, suffering a severe concussion. Steelers coach Chuck Noll erupted afterward, accusing Atkinson of criminal behavior. Atkinson, furious at the charge, filed a $2 million defamation lawsuit against Noll. Though the suit was eventually dismissed, the bitterness endured. It wasn't just words in the press, it was legal warfare waged in parallel with on-field battles. That lawsuit revealed something essential about this rivalry. It was never confined to the scoreboard. The hatred seeped into courtrooms, headlines, and the way players carried themselves in everyday life. Ask Atkinson, and he'd tell you the Steelers were hypocrites portraying themselves as disciplined while dishing out cheap shots of their own. Ask the Steelers, and they'd describe the Raiders as thugs, who turned football into street fighting. Both sides clung to their narratives, and both believed the other had crossed lines that could never be forgiven. Yet what made this rivalry resonate so deeply wasn't just the violence or the bitterness. It was timing. The 1970s were the years when the NFL transformed from a niche sport into America's game. Television was exploding, broadcasting every hit, every concussion, every sideline skirmish into millions of living rooms. The Steelers and Raiders didn't just play football. They performed a weekly morality play in front of a national audience. Were you drawn to Pittsburgh's stoic toughness or Oakland's rebellious chaos? Either way, you were watching. The paradox is impossible to ignore. Fans condemned the brutality, but ratings soared when these two teams collided. People claimed to hate the violence, yet they tuned in because of it. Rivalries like Steelers-Raiders exposed the truth. America's relationship with football was still as built on a fascination with controlled violence. The hits that left men broken were the same hits that drove the sport's popularity into the stratosphere. For the players, though, nothing felt controlled. Lynn Swann battled the effects of concussions long after his career ended. George Atkinson, forever tied to the criminal behavior label, carried bitterness well into retirement. Jack Tatum, already infamous for his nickname, the Assassin, became a symbol of brutality after his 1978 hit on Darryl Stingley left a Patriots receiver paralyzed. Though that moment didn't involve the Steelers, it emerged from the same culture of violence. These rivalries encouraged the culture where proving toughness meant living on the edge of catastrophe. Even the coaches became part of the legend. Chuck Noll, usually reserved, broke character to lash out at Atkinson. John Madden, larger than life on the sideline, defended his players fiercely, portraying them as misunderstood warriors rather than villains. Both men were architects of greatness, but also guardians of grudges. Their rivalry shaped their legacies as much as their victories did. When I reflect on those years, what strikes me most is how the scars never faded. Decades later, when players from both sides are interviewed, the anger still flickers in their voices. Franco Harris never stopped being asked about the immaculate reception. Raiders veterans still argue the play was illegal. The bitterness is not nostalgia's living history, unresolved and raw. The numbers underline the drama. The Steelers won 4 Super Bowls in the 1970s, 3 of which required them to go through Oakland. The Raiders, for their part, finally broke through in 1976, defeating Pittsburgh in the AFC Championship before claiming their first Super Bowl. The rivalry produced legends, dynasties, and unforgettable moments, but it also left a trail of bodies, lawsuits, and fractured relationships. And this is the heart of the matter. Rivalries in the NFL are never just about football. They become part of identity. They become battles for respect, for dignity, for legacy. They shape the way fans see their teams, the way players remember their careers, and the way history tells the story of the sport itself. The Steelers and Raiders rivalry of the 1970s was more than a chapter in football history. It was a mirror reflecting America's own contradictions. The disdain for violence paired with the hunger to watch it unfold. The rhetoric of sportsmanship colliding with the reality of brutality. The pursuit of glory shadowed by the costs paid in broken bodies and bitter memories. When I think back to those games, I don't just see touchdowns and trophies. I see Jack Tatum staring across the line of scrimmage, daring anyone to come his way. I see Jack Lambert snarling, his teeth clenched in defiance. I see Swan, fragile but determined, getting back up after concussions that would end most men's seasons. And I see 2 teams bound together by hatred, locked in a rivalry that redefined what football could mean. This was only the beginning of our journey. One rivalry, one decade, one unforgettable clash of cultures. But the NFL has never been defined by just one feud. From coast to coast, across eras, rivalries have burned with the same intensities, sometimes uplifting the game, sometimes staining it forever. And if this was just the first chapter, the question becomes inevitable. What other rivalries carried scars far deeper than the scoreboard could ever show? When I think about the 1990s, the first images that come to mind are not of politics or music or even culture. They are of 2 teams, separated by 2,000 miles, locked in a battle that felt like destiny itself. The Dallas Cowboys and the San Francisco 49ers weren't just opponents. They were dynasties colliding, legacies clashing, empires rising and falling in real time. And for a generation of fans, this rivalry wasn't background noise. It was the soundtrack of the decade. The roots of this feud trace back to the 1970s, when Dallas, already branded as America's team, repeatedly crushed San Francisco's playoff dreams. The Cowboys beat the 49ers in 3 straight NFC Championship games from 1970 to 1972, leaving scars in the Bay Area that lingered for decades. But rivalries thrive on revenge, and by the 1980s, San Francisco, powered by Joe Montana and Bill Walsh's West Coast offense, had overtaken Dallas as the NFL's model of innovation and success. 4 Super Bowls later, the 49ers had built their own dynasty. By the early 1990s, though, the stage was set for a new clash. San Francisco was still elite, with Montana passing the torch to Steve Young, and Jerry Rice cementing himself as perhaps the greatest receiver the game has ever seen. Dallas, once a fading giant, had reloaded under Jimmy Johnson, building a roster around 3 young superstars who would come to be known as the Triplets: quarterback Troy Aikman, running back Emmitt Smith, and wide receiver Michael Irvin. The collision was inevitable. From 1992 to 1994, the Cowboys and 49ers faced each other in 3 straight NFC Championship games. Each contest felt less like a football game and more like a referendum on the future of the league. Whoever won didn't just go to the Super Bowl, they took the mantle of dominance, and with it, control over an entire era. The 1992 clash was the turning point. Dallas, young and hungry, stormed into Candlestick Park and stunned the 49ers 30-20. For the Cowboys, it was the dawn of a dynasty. For the 49ers, it was humiliation proof that their reign was under siege. The next year, Dallas proved it was no fluke, defeating San Francisco again, this time in Texas Stadium. Aikman was brilliant, Smith was unstoppable, and Irvin torched defenders with ruthless efficiency. The Cowboys celebrated, the 49ers seethed, and the rivalry's intensity deepened. By 1994, the tension had reached its breaking point. The 49ers, desperate to reclaim supremacy, overhauled their roster. They signed free agent stars like Deion Sanders, a move that sent shockwaves through the league. Sanders, the electrifying cornerback and return man, was not just a football player, he was a cultural icon. His arrival in San Francisco symbolized the arms race this rivalry had become. That season, the 49ers finally struck back, defeating Dallas in the NFC Championship and going on to win Super Bowl 29 for Steve Young, who had lived for years in Joe Montana's shadow. It was validation at last. For Dallas, it was a wound they would never fully heal. What made this rivalry extraordinary wasn't just the stakes, it was the spectacle. These games weren't 3 yards and galad dust football. They were showcases of speed, precision, and star power. Jerry Rice against Deion Sanders, Emmitt Smith grinding through tackles. Michael Irvin's fiery intensity matched against San Francisco's defensive swagger. Every matchup felt like a Hall of Fame reunion before the fact. And the personalities, they were as combustible as the games themselves. Michael Irvin played with an edge that bordered on defiance. The playmaker was brash, emotional, and unapologetically competitive. Jerry Rice, by contrast, was surgical a perfectionist whose work ethic made him legendary. Emmitt Smith, soft-spoken yet relentless, embodied Dallas's power. Steve Young, finally freed from Montana's shadow, played with urgency, as if every throw was a chance to rewrite his place in history. These men didn't just represent teams, they represented entire philosophies of greatness. The statistics underline the magnitude. Between 1992 and 1995, the Cowboys and 49ers combined to win 4 consecutive Super Bowls. Whoever emerged from their NFC Championship clashes was almost guaranteed to hoist the Lombardi Trophy. That meant their rivalry wasn't just about bragging rights, it was about deciding who would define the decade. But rivalries of this magnitude don't remain on the field. They seep into locker rooms, headlines, and cultural identity. Dallas became the picture of 1990's excess, the bright lights. The star on the helmet, the image of America's team, rebuilt under owner Jerry Jones. The 49ers, meanwhile, were Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley innovators, risk-takers, a franchise defined by precision and style. When they met, it was more than football. It was a clash between Texas swagger and California cool, between brash power and calculated brilliance. The emotional toll was just as real as the trophies. Steve Young admitted that losing to Dallas in back-to-back NFC championships was among the lowest points of his career. You don't get many shots, he reflected later. And when you lose them to the same team, it eats at you. For Dallas, the 1994 defeat to San Francisco was devastating, not because it ended their run, but because it exposed the limits of their dominance. Even dynasties, it seemed, could be dethroned. Looking back, what makes this rivalry timeless is the sense that we were watching legends collide in their prime. Every play felt monumental because it wasn't just about winning, it was about legacy. It was about who would be remembered as the team of the decade, who would hold the keys to football immortality. And when I reflect on it now, decades later, I realize that rivalries like Cowboys-49ers are rare precisely because of what they demand. 2 teams at the height of their powers colliding again and again with everything on the line. 2 fan bases living and dying with every snap. 2 legacies forged in opposition, each defining itself by conquering or being conquered by the other. The 1970s gave us brutality. The 1990s gave us brilliance. Different eras, different styles, but the same truth. Rivalries are the heartbeat of the NFL. They elevate games into epics, players into icons, and memories into history. Yet the Cowboys and 49ers were not the last rivalry to reshape the league. In the years to come, others would emerge, rivalries marked by bitterness, by cultural divides, by stakes so high they changed the very meaning of competition. And that is where our story leads next. I remember the first time I saw highlights of Pittsburgh and Oakland colliding in the 1970s. It wasn't football in the sense most people imagine today. It was a collision of cultures, philosophies, and raw survival. On one sideline stood the Pittsburgh Steelers, blue-collar to the bone, molded by the steel mills and the grit of western Pennsylvania. On the other, the Oakland Raiders, a renegade tribe built on swagger, intimidation, and the belief that rules were meant to be bent, if not outright broken. Together, they created one of the fiercest rivalries the NFL has ever known. When people talk about rivalries, they often mention geography. Neighbors, city pride, fan bases split by a river or state line. But Steelers versus Raiders was different. These teams were separated by thousands of miles, east and west coasts apart. What made their clashes legendary wasn't proximity. It was philosophy. The Steelers were methodical, structured, the embodiment of order. The Raiders were chaotic, improvisational, defiantly wild. And when these two forces met, the violence went beyond the ordinary. It bordered on personal warfare. The seeds of that rivalry were planted in the early 1970s, when both franchises were rising at the same time. Pittsburgh, long a laughingstock in the NFL, suddenly found its backbone under head coach Chuck Noll. By drafting players like Joe Green, Jack Ham, Jack Lambert, Mel Blount, and Franco Harris, the Steelers became an immovable wall of discipline and ferocity. Across the country, Al Davis had built the Raiders into a band of misfits, outlaws, and cast-offs who thrived under John Madden's fiery leadership. Where the Steelers prided themselves on fundamentals, the Raiders prided themselves on intimidation. Where the Steelers demanded conformity to system, the Raiders encouraged individuality. And that contrast made every hit feel heavier, every loss more bitter, every victory more profound. The rivalry's ignition point came in 1972 with a single play that still divides fan bases to this day: the Immaculate Reception. December 23rd, Three Rivers Stadium. The Raiders held a 7-6 lead with less than 30 seconds left. Terry Bradshaw fired a desperate pass that ricocheted off Jack Tatum and into the hands of Franco Harris, who miraculously scooped it just before it hit the ground and sprinted into the end zone. Steelers win. Chaos erupts. Pittsburgh calls it divine intervention. Oakland calls it robbery. Even decades later, whether the ball touched the ground is still debated. But one thing is certain: that moment lit a fire between the two franchises that burned, hotter than anything else in football at the time. After that, every meeting felt like retribution. In 1973, the Raiders returned the favor in the playoffs, dominating Pittsburgh with brutal physicality. In 1974, it swung back. The Steelers knocking Oakland out on their way to their first Super Bowl. In 1975, the Raiders came back again, only to fall short once more in a bitter AFC Championship game. And in 1976, Oakland finally broke through, beating Pittsburgh en route to their first Super Bowl title. For straight years, the road to the Lombardi Trophy ran through the same two teams, and neither gave an inch. What set this rivalry apart wasn't just the stakes, it was the brutality. Jack Tatum, nicknamed the Assassin, was the Raiders' enforcer, a safety whose hits often felt like a punishment rather than a tackle. On the other side, Mel Blount redefined cornerback play with his aggressive bump-hand run coverage, practically mauling receivers at the line of scrimmage. These weren't just contests of skill, they were collisions of raw power, often leaving bodies sprawled across the turf. Those games, Joe Green once said, weren't just football. They were survival tests. The personal hatred spilled off the field as well. Raiders players would often accuse the Steelers of arrogance, of carrying themselves as if they alone represented football purity. Steelers players shot back, calling the Raiders dirty, undisciplined, and lawless. John Madden once admitted, "If there was a game where I knew it would take weeks to recover, it was against Pittsburgh. You didn't just play the Steelers, you endured them." And Jack Lambert, the fiery middle linebacker of Pittsburgh, put it even more bluntly, "If I could get up off a pile and see a Raider there, I'd hit him again." These weren't casual statements. They reflected a mindset. Both teams knew that to win in that era, you had to go through the other, and there was no easy way out. Fans fed off the hostility. Oakland's black hole reveled in its villain role, while Pittsburgh's terrible towels became a sea of defiance. To watch those games wasn't just to watch football. It was to watch two entire identities, the industrial steelworker and the rebellious outlaw, crash into each other at full speed. The rivalry also shaped the larger NFL. The league in the 1970s was at a crossroads, balancing its rough, brutal roots with a growing push toward a polished television product. Steelers-Raiders embodied that tension. Games between them were often marred by penalties, injuries, and accusations of unsportsmanlike conduct. But they also produced some of the most dramatic football ever played. For the NFL, it was both a blessing and a curse. The violence drew viewers, but it also raised questions about how far was too far. In many ways, those clashes forced the league to begin redefining its rules, eventually leading to greater protections for players. Even so, the players themselves wore their scars like badges of honor. Franco Harris once said, "Every time we played Oakland, I knew I'd leave the game limping. But that was the cost of greatness." Gene Upshaw, the Hall of Fame guard of the Raiders, echoed the same. "Pittsburgh brought out the worst in us, and I mean that as a compliment. They forced you to dig deeper, hit harder, and sometimes cross the line." Those admissions show why this rivalry mattered. It wasn't just about winning. It was about legacy, toughness, and respect earned the hard way. By the end of the decade, both teams had claimed multiple Super Bowls, cementing themselves as dynasties. But neither reached those heights without the other. In fact, it's fair to argue that, without the Raiders, the Steelers might never have become the Iron Dynasty of the 1970s. And without the Steelers, the Raiders may never have proven their outlaw culture could deliver championships. Rivalries are often defined by mutual dependence, and here, that dependence was forged in blood and bruises. Looking back, I see those battles as more than football. They were cultural mirror images of America in the 1970s. On one side, order, discipline, and tradition. On the other, rebellion, individuality, and defiance. Both resonated deeply with fans who saw themselves reflected on the field. And when they collided, the stakes felt higher than a scoreboard. They felt like clashes over what football, and maybe even America itself, should represent. Today, when people recall the great rivalries of the NFL, Steelers-Raiders remains near the top. Not because they played each other every year, not because they shared a border, but because they embodied extremes. In every crunch of pads, in every bitter post-game comment, in every rematch, there was a sense that this was bigger than sport. It was survival. It was respect. It was the dark side of competition laid bare, and in that darkness, both teams carved out immortality. As I think back on those years, I realize the NFL has tried to move past that brand of rivalry, polishing itself for modern audiences. Reducing the edges, softening the blows. But the echoes of Steelers-Raiders remain. They remind us that sometimes greatness is forged not in comfort, but in conflict. And no conflict was sharper, harder, or more unforgettable than Pittsburgh and Oakland in the 1970s. When I think about rivalries, there's one that stands above them all. Older than dynasties, older than television, older than most of the stadiums we cheer in today. Bears versus Packers. Chicago and Green Bay. It wasn't just the birth of a rivalry. It was the birth of football itself. The first meeting came in 1921, back when leather helmets still barely shielded men from the pounding they absorbed. Chicago, then called the Staleys before becoming the Bears, squared off against the fledgling Green Bay Packers. And from that moment forward, neither franchise has been able to look away. For more than a century, these two teams have defined what it means to hate and respect in equal measure. What made it so enduring was the closeness of the cities and the stark contrast in their identities. Chicago was the urban giant, industrial, tough, defined by smoke, sweat, and stockyards. Green Bay was small-town America, a community-owned team with players who often held second jobs in the off-season. One embodied the power of the metropolis. The other embodied the intimacy of the neighborhood, and yet both were connected by football, clashing on frozen fields where the air smelled of cigar smoke, beer, and the raw violence of the line of scrimmage. George Halas, the iron founder of the Bears, carried his team like a general. Curly Lambeau, Green Bay's namesake coach, led with equal intensity. Their personal dislike bled into the teams themselves, shaping decades of hostility. Players weren't just competing for wins, they were competing for the identity of the league itself. As the NFL grew from a ragged collection of clubs into a national institution, the Bears and Packers were its cornerstones, and every collision between them was a reminder of how football had been built. Over the years, names etched themselves into the memory of the rivalry. Bronco Nagurski, Bart Starr, Dick Butkus, Brett Favre, and each era carried its own chapter of hostility. In the 1960s, Vince Lombardi's Packers stood as the standard of discipline, breaking Chicago hearts with methodical precision. In the 1980s, Mike Ditka's Bears swung the pendulum back. Their defense, the famed 46, punishing Green Bay in ways that felt almost medieval. And in the 1990s and 2000s, Brett Favre and later Aaron Rodgers tormented Chicago, turning Lambeau Field into a nightmare for generations of Bears fans. Yet what makes Bears-Packers unique is its longevity. Rivalries flare and fade, but this one never did. Even when one team dominated the other for stretches, even when the games had no playoff implications, the tension never died. Because for these two cities, beating each other wasn't just about standings. It was about pride. For the working-class fans of Chicago and the tight-knit communities of Wisconsin, these Sundays were cultural battlegrounds, proof that identity mattered as much as trophies. But as football modernized, rivalries shifted. The league expanded. Television turned games into events, and star quarterbacks became the faces of franchises. And in that new landscape, another rivalry rose to dominate an entire era. Patriots versus Colts. Unlike Bears-Packers, this one didn't span a century. It burned brightest in the 2000s, but in that window, it reshaped how we think about competition. At its core, Patriots-Colts wasn't just a team rivalry. It was Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning. Brady, the overlooked sixth-round pick, molded by Bill Belichick's system, thrived on precision, efficiency, and unrelenting adaptability. Manning, the golden-armed first overall pick, the face of a franchise, was football's ultimate field general, audibling at the line, reading defenses like an open book, and orchestrating the game as though he were conducting a symphony. Their clashes weren't just games. They were chess matches broadcast to millions, each move scrutinized, each throw carrying the weight of a legacy. In the early years, Brady and the Patriots had the upper hand. New England's defense suffocated Manning repeatedly in the playoffs, turning the Colts' high-powered offense into frustration and silence. Critics began to question whether Peyton, despite his brilliance, could ever overcome the Patriots' iron grip on the AFC. It wasn't just about one quarterback versus another. It became a referendum on greatness itself. Was greatness defined by raw talent and records, or by rings and resilience? The narrative flipped in 2006 in one of the most memorable AFC Championship games in NFL history. Down 21-3, Manning led a furious comeback against Brady and Belichick, a victory that sent the Colts to the Super Bowl, and eventually their long-awaited title. For the first time, the rivalry felt balanced. Brady had the early dominance, Manning seized his vindication. And every meeting afterward felt like destiny repeating itself. Players on both sides admitted it was different, preparing for those games. You knew, former Colts receiver Reggie Wayne once said that if you beat New England, you weren't just winning a game. You were proving something bigger. Patriots safety Rodney Harrison echoed that sentiment from the other side. Stopping Manning wasn't about football. It was about survival. The league leaned into it too. Brady versus Manning became appointment television, scheduled for prime time, marketed as the defining duel of a generation. And unlike Bears-Packers, which was rooted in regional identity, Patriots-Colts embodied the NFL's transformation into a national spectacle. It wasn't about city pride anymore. It was about narrative, legacy, and the clash of two different philosophies of quarterbacking. Looking at both rivalries side by side, you can see the arc of the NFL itself. Bears-Packers is raw, primal, rooted in the early soil of the league. It reminds us that football grew out of local pride, cold weather, brutality, and the desire of communities to measure themselves against their neighbors. Patriots-Colts, meanwhile, is the modern evolution, a rivalry defined by television, celebrity quarterbacks, and the storytelling power of a league that had learned how to sell narratives as much as games. But both share something deeper. They show us that rivalries matter because they force the best out of everyone involved. The Packers define themselves through Chicago. The Bears sharpen their teeth on Green Bay. Brady became Brady because Manning existed as his mirror, his foil, his rival. Manning became Manning because Brady stood in his way, daring him to be better. Without one, the other might not have reached the same heights. When I think about it now, I realize rivalries are football's most honest truth. They reveal not just who wins and who loses, but who we are when pushed to our limits. Bears versus Packers taught us that some battles never die. That tradition carries power across generations. Patriots versus Colts taught us that even in a polished, commercialized era, competition can still feel deeply personal, deeply human. And in both stories, we see the dark side of greatness. That to truly rise, you need someone standing across from you, daring you to fail. Some rivalries are born from geography, others from history. But then there are those born from something deeper: politics, identity, and the idea of who gets to call themselves America's team. Few rivalries capture that complexity better than Cowboys versus Washington. The story begins in 1960, when the Dallas Cowboys entered the NFL as an expansion team. On the surface, it was just another franchise joining the league. But to Washington, it felt like an intrusion. At the time, Washington was the southernmost NFL team, with a stranglehold on fans across the Southeast. Dallas's arrival threatened not just their dominance on the field, but their monopoly off it. From day one, Washington's ownership made it clear. The Cowboys weren't just another opponent. They were an enemy. The tension escalated quickly. In the 1960s and 70s, as Dallas began to emerge as a powerhouse under Tom Landry, Washington often stood in their way. Landry's Cowboys became known for discipline, innovation, and the clean-cut image that would later earn them the moniker America's team. Washington, meanwhile, leaned into its underdog role, drawing strength from gritty players and a fan base that treated every matchup as war. The 1972 NFC Championship game crystallized the hostility. Washington dismantled Dallas 26-3, sending them home humiliated. In the locker room afterward, Washington's George Allen reportedly told his team, "We don't like those Cowboys. They represent everything we don't." To Washington, Dallas symbolized flash and arrogance. To Dallas, Washington symbolized bitterness and envy. It wasn't just football anymore. It was culture clashing on the gridiron. Through the 1980s, the rivalry intensified. Washington captured 3 Super Bowls under Joe Gibbs, while Dallas maintained its mystique under Landry. Every game between the two carried playoff weight, and every hit seemed personal. Cowboys lineman Randy White once said, "You could lose every other game, but if you beat Washington, the season still meant something." For fans, the feeling was mutual. In Texas, beating Washington was proof of dominance. In D.C., beating Dallas was proof of pride. By the 1990s, the rivalry took on a new dimension. Jerry Jones bought the Cowboys. Jimmy Johnson rebuilt the roster. And suddenly, Dallas wasn't just competitive. They were dominant, winning 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. Washington, in contrast, began to struggle, falling into mediocrity. But even as the balance of power shifted, the hatred didn't. Washington fans still circled the Cowboys on their calendar. And Cowboys fans relished every chance to remind D.C. who America's team really was. This is what makes Cowboys versus Washington unique. Even when one side faltered, the rivalry never lost its fire. It wasn't just about standings. It was about identity. The Cowboys symbolized glamour, star power, and national attention. Washington symbolized defiance, tradition, and a refusal to bow to that spotlight. To this day, when those two teams meet, you can feel the tension humming beneath the surface. A century-long feud carried on the shoulders of new generations. But while Cowboys-Washington is rooted in history and symbolism, another rivalry emerged decades later that reminded everyone what pure, unfiltered football animosity looked like. Ravens versus Steelers. If Cowboys-Washington was about identity, Ravens-Steelers was about violence. From the late 1990s through the 2010s, these two AFC North giants played games that felt less like football and more like heavyweight prize fights. Both franchises were built on defense, both prided themselves on physicality, and both believed that toughness wasn't optional, it was survival. The Ravens entered the league in 1996, inheriting the legacy of toughness from Baltimore Colts fans and quickly carving out their own. Ray Lewis became the face of the franchise, a middle linebacker whose passion and ferocity embodied everything Baltimore wanted to be. Meanwhile, Pittsburgh already had decades of defensive dominance in its DNA, with players like Joey Porter, James Harrison, and Troy Polamalu. The Steelers' defense struck fear into every opponent. Put the two on the same field, and you had collisions that shook stadiums. What made Ravens-Steelers unforgettable wasn't just the physicality, it was the parity. Unlike rivalries where one side dominated, these games were almost always close, decided by a field goal, a turnover, or a single defensive stand. From 2008 to 2010 alone, 9 of their 11 meetings were decided by 7 points or fewer. Players on both sides admitted the pain lingered long after the final whistle. "You didn't just play the Steelers," Ray Lewis once said. "You survived them." And they'd say the same about us. The rivalry reached its peak in the late 2000s, when Baltimore's emerging quarterback Joe Flacco and Pittsburgh's Ben Roethlisberger faced off in multiple playoff battles. The 2008 AFC Championship game became an instant classic, a defensive war where every yard felt stolen, and every hit felt like punishment. Pittsburgh prevailed that night, but Baltimore never forgot. And 2 years later, they met again in the playoffs, splitting victories in games that seemed to embody everything the NFL once was. Brutal, bruising, and unrelentingly intense. For fans, these games carried as much weight as championships. Ravens supporters in Baltimore saw beating Pittsburgh as validation, a reminder that their city mattered in the NFL landscape. Steelers fans, steeped in the tradition of the Steel Curtain, viewed Baltimore as the only opponent worthy of their hatred. To this day, ask anyone in either city, and they'll tell you, no victory feels sweeter, and no loss feels more bitter. What ties these rivalries? Cowboys versus Washington, and Ravens versus Steelers. Together is their ability to transcend standings. Sometimes Washington was down, sometimes Baltimore struggled, but the matchups never lost meaning. Because rivalries aren't just about wins and losses. They're about history, identity, and respect earned the hard way. Cowboys versus Washington reminds us that rivalries can be rooted in culture and symbolism. A clash of identities that spans generations. Ravens versus Steelers reminds us that sometimes rivalries are forged in the furnace of violence, where two teams beat each other into history. Together, they show the range of what rivalries can mean, from politics and pride to survival and scars. And in both cases, one truth shines through. Rivalries are the lifeblood of the NFL. They remind us that football is never just a game. It's about who we are, who we were, and who we refuse to let ourselves become. Some rivalries are born from borders, others from bloodlines. Giants versus Eagles is both. For nearly a century, two cities separated by less than 100 miles have poured every ounce of pride, resentment, and defiance into one of the NFL's most enduring feuds. It began in 1933, when the Eagles joined the league and immediately looked north to measure themselves against the established New York Giants. Philadelphia, still finding its footing, carried a chip on its shoulder. New York, already boasting championships, carried itself like the big brother. The imbalance fueled early bitterness, and over time, that bitterness hardened into something far more permanent. In the 1940s and 50s, the rivalry blossomed as the Giants established themselves with players like Frank Gifford and Sam Huff, while the Eagles countered with legends like Steve Van Buren and Chuck Bednarik. Bednarik's presence alone epitomized the edge of this rivalry. A two-way player, Bednarik famously delivered some of the most punishing hits the game has ever seen, and his clashes with New York became stories Philadelphia fans carried for decades. The true venom of the rivalry, though, wasn't just in the players. It lived in the fans. Philadelphia and New York are two cities defined by their intensity. For Eagles fans, New York symbolized arrogance and wealth, a city that looked down on them. For Giants fans, Philadelphia represented bitterness, a city that fought with a chip on its shoulder because it had to. When those two mindsets collided, the games felt less like contests and more like collisions of identity. The 1960s and 70s gave the rivalry its first true turning points. Philadelphia, often struggling, found joy in spoiling New York's seasons. In 1960, the Eagles captured their first NFL championship by beating Vince Lombardi's Packers, but they never forgot the battles with the Giants that gave them legitimacy. In 1978, one of the rivalry's most infamous moments occurred. The miracle at the Meadowlands. With the Giants leading late and only seconds left, instead of kneeling, quarterback Joe Pizarczyk fumbled a handoff, and Herman Edwards scooped it up for Philadelphia, racing into the end zone for a stunning victory. That single play not only symbolized the rivalry-esque cruelty, but also became a defining humiliation for New York fans. The 1980s and 90s intensified the hatred. Bill Parcells' Giants and Buddy Ryan's Eagles clashed in games that were less about points and more about punishment. Both defenses were ferocious, both fan bases hostile, and both cities unrelenting. Ask anyone who played in those years, and they'll tell you. Giants-Eagles wasn't just another game on the calendar. It was the one that lingered, the one you circled, the one you felt in your bones long after the final whistle. And then came the 2000s, when Donovan McNabb's Eagles and Eli Manning's Giants carried the torch into a new era. Playoff games between the two only stoked the fire. In 2008, the Eagles marched into New York and upset the defending champion Giants in the NFC divisional round, silencing the Meadowlands and deepening the wound. A year later, another miracle. DeSean Jackson's 2010 punt return walk-off in. The miracle at the new Meadowlands. Giants fans called it heartbreak. Eagles fans called it destiny. The beauty of Giants versus Eagles is that no matter the records, the games still feel personal, even when one franchise is down. The rivalry keeps its edge because the animosity between New York and Philadelphia runs deeper than standings. It's cultural, geographic, emotional. Beating the other means validation, pride, and proof that one city stands taller than the other, at least for that week. But while Giants-Eagles reflects history's endurance, another rivalry in the modern NFL emerged not from geography, but from dominance. A rivalry defined by coaches, defenses, and a fight for control of the NFC West. Seahawks versus 49ers. In the early 2010s, these two franchises collided at the perfect moment. San Francisco, resurrected by Jim Harbaugh, built an identity around toughness, defense, and the rise of quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Seattle, forged by Pete Carroll, carried the same DNA, defense first, a young star in Russell Wilson, and a swaggering identity embodied by the Legion of Boom. The parallels made their meetings inevitable flashpoints. Every game felt like an audition for supremacy. The defenses were suffocating, the hits brutal, and the tension unbearable. Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, and Com Chancellor terrorized offenses for Seattle, while Patrick Willis, Navarro Bowman, and Aldon Smith anchored San Francisco's ferocity. These weren't ordinary contests. They were trench wars fought across the width of the NFC. The rivalry's defining moment came in the 2013 NFC Championship. San Francisco held the ball late, driving for the go-ahead score. Kaepernick lofted a pass to Michael Crabtree in the corner of the end zone. And there was Richard Sherman, leaping, deflecting, sealing the game with the tip heard around the world. His post-game interview, fiery and unapologetic, embodied everything about the rivalry. Personal, raw, and unwilling to hide the disdain. Seattle went on to win the Super Bowl, but for 49ers fans, that loss still stings. Not just for what it meant on the scoreboard, but for what it meant culturally. Unlike Giants-Eagles, where history and tradition fuel the fire, Seahawks-49ers is defined by timing and intensity. Both teams were at their peaks simultaneously, and neither could escape the shadow of the other. The battles weren't just about wins. They were about proving dominance in a division that had become the NFL's most feared. Even as years passed and rosters changed, the animosity never fully faded. Seattle's dominance, fueled by Wilson and Carroll, often came at San Francisco's expense. Later, with Kyle Shanahan leading the 49ers' resurgence, the tables began to turn. Young stars like Deebo Samuel and Nick Bosa reignited the fight, ensuring that the next generation of fans would carry the hostility forward. What links Giants-Eagles and Seahawks-49ers is their ability to show us two different faces of rivalry. One is ancient, rooted in decades of cultural and geographic tension. The other is modern, born from simultaneous greatness and amplified by national television. Yet both prove the same point. Rivalries are the lifeblood of the NFL. They give the regular season its stakes, the playoffs their drama, and fans their identity. When I think about the Eagles and Giants, I see a rivalry that has stood the test of time, carried by cities that refuse to yield. When I think about the Seahawks and 49ers, I see a rivalry that burst into existence with such force that it instantly became unforgettable. One is a slow burn across a century. The other is a supernova, explosive and undeniable. And both remind us that football isn't just about the game in front of us. It's about the history behind us and the battles still to come. I've always believed rivalries are the lifeblood of the NFL. They turn a sport into a theater of memory, anger, and loyalty that lasts generations. Some rivalries are written in geography, others in history, and some in the personalities of men who refuse to lose. Batch 7 takes us into two rivalries that, on the surface, could not be more different. One, a violent feud born out of the AFL days of the 1960s and 70s. The other, a modern chess match between two quarterbacks who elevated football into high art. But together, the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Oakland Raiders and Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning remind us that rivalries are not confined to decades. They are eternal, shaped by time but never diminished by it. The Chiefs and Raiders were forged in hate. This was not some polite regional competition. From the very beginning, when Lamar Hunt's Kansas City Chiefs and Al Davis's Raiders locked horns in the old American Football League, there was blood in the air. These weren't franchises that respected each other. They despised one another. The rivalry took shape in the 1960s when the Raiders, led by Davis, sought to define themselves as the rebels of professional football, a team that embraced outcasts and built an identity on intimidation. Kansas City was different, organized, disciplined, coached by Hank Stram with precision and swagger. Their clashes were brutal. The Chiefs beat the Raiders in the 1969 AFL Championship, a victory that sent Kansas City to Super Bowl IV, where they would defeat the Minnesota Vikings and forever legitimize the AFL. For Raiders fans, it was humiliation. For the Chiefs, it was proof they could stand toe-to-toe with anyone, and the games never softened. Raiders linebacker Phil Villapiano once admitted, "We hated those guys, hated them, and they hated us." There wasn't a handshake after those games. It was survival. Every time they met, the scars deepened. In 1970, a Monday Night Football clash turned into one of the most violent games in league history. Late hits, brawls, taunting. This wasn't just football. It was warfare. Chiefs quarterback Len Dawson described the rivalry bluntly. It was on T, just a game on the schedule. It was personal. They wanted to hurt you, and we wanted to hurt them. As the decades rolled on, the intensity never faded. Even when both teams struggled, Chiefs versus Raiders was a circle-the-calendar event. The image of Arrowhead Stadium shaking with red-clad fans screaming hatred at silver and black. Invaders remains one of the purest depictions of rivalry in American sports. In Oakland, the Black Hole turned games against the Chiefs into primal theater. Fans dressed in spikes and skull paint, screaming at visiting Kansas City players as if their lives depended on it. Rivalry in this sense became ritual, each team needing the other to define its own identity. But rivalries evolve. And as the NFL grew into a billion-dollar empire, a new kind of rivalry emerged. Not between cities or ideologies, but between men, between quarterbacks who redefined what it meant to compete. Tom Brady versus Peyton Manning was not a feud born of blood, but of brilliance. It was cerebral, elegant, and yet just as fierce as anything the Raiders and Chiefs had ever produced. Brady and Manning met 17 times in their careers. Brady won the first 6. Manning clawed back to win some of the biggest ones later. And every time they stepped on the field, the world watched. They were not just quarterbacks, they were philosophies. Brady, the unheralded 6th-round pick, shaped by Bill Belichick into the ultimate system quarterback. Precise, ruthless, cold under pressure. Manning, the golden boy from a football dynasty, carried the weight of expectation and transformed the quarterback position into a kind of artistry. Calling plays at the line, dissecting defenses with audacity. The statistics tell part of the story. Brady's teams went 11-6 against Manning's, but numbers never fully capture the weight. It wasn't just Patriots versus Colts, or Patriots versus Broncos. When Manning moved to Denver, it was something larger. Every matchup felt like a referendum on greatness. In January 2007, Manning finally beat Brady in the AFC Championship, leading the Colts back from a 21-3 deficit to win 38-34. As he walked off the field, he knew it wasn't just about a trip to the Super Bowl. It was about finally defeating the man who had shadowed his legacy. Brady later reflected, "You always knew if you were playing Peyton, you had to be perfect, 'cause if you weren't, he'd beat you." What made Brady versus Manning extraordinary was not just the competition, but the mutual respect. They were enemies on the field, but never off it. They understood that each needed the other. Manning once said, "Some people might be surprised to hear this, but I cherished those games. Playing against Tom brought out the best in me. He forced me to raise my game. Brady echoed the sentiment after Manning's retirement. He made me a better player. He was the greatest quarterback I ever faced. If the Chiefs and Raiders represent the savage, bone-rattling past of NFL rivalries, Brady versus Manning represents the cerebral, modern future. One rivalry was about fists and fury, the other about brains and brilliance. But both remind us that rivalry is not about hatred alone, it's about definition. The Raiders could not define themselves without the Chiefs, just as Brady's legend cannot be told without Manning standing across from him. I reflect on these rivalries and see the thread that runs through them: the need for opposition. The NFL thrives on these contrasts. Chiefs versus Raiders taught fans that rivalry could be visceral, that every snap carried danger. Brady versus Manning taught us that rivalry could be elegant, a duel of minds as much as bodies. Both captured something essential about why we watch, not just to see victory, but to see the clash of equals, the fire of competition burning so brightly that it illuminates an entire era. And yet, when we strip away the noise, the violence, the statistics, what remains is respect. For all the hatred between Raiders and Chiefs fans, the rivalry gave meaning to their Sundays. For all the pressure between Brady and Manning, their duel left behind an indelible standard of excellence. Rivalries end, players retire, coaches move on, but the echoes remain etched into memory, into history, into the mythology of a league built on collisions of both body and will. The NFL's darkest rivalries are not just games. They are stories of survival, ambition, pride, and the relentless pursuit of victory. Chiefs versus Raiders. Brady versus Manning. Different in style, united in purpose. They remind us that without a rival, there is no greatness. And without greatness, football loses its soul. Rivalry is not a luxury, and football is the foundation. Every team needs an adversary, someone to measure itself against, someone to hate, and someone to remind them why the game matters. In Batch 8, I move between two rivalries that may seem separated by era and geography. But together, they tell us something crucial about the league's soul. One belongs to the frozen fields of the Rust Belt, where the Cleveland Browns and Pittsburgh Steelers have been colliding since the 1950s. The other belongs to the Deep South, where the New Orleans Saints and Atlanta Falcons transformed regional pride into bitter warfare. Different backdrops, different histories, but the same truth. Rivalry gives the NFL its edge, its identity, its heartbeat. The Browns and Steelers rivalry is one of the most enduring in professional sports. It began in 1950, when the Browns joined the NFL after dominating the old All-America Football Conference. At that time, Cleveland was the class of the league. With Paul Brown on the sideline and Otto Graham under center, the Browns were the standard everyone else chased. Pittsburgh, by contrast, was a franchise defined by struggle, mired in mediocrity, and desperate for legitimacy. In those early years, Cleveland owned the matchup. They won the first 8 meetings. They lorded their dominance over Pittsburgh, and the fans in Ohio made sure the Steelers never forgot it. But football, like life, shifts. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Pittsburgh had transformed. Chuck Noll arrived. Steel curtain defense was born. Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, and Mean Joe Green turned the Steelers into the dynasty of the decade. And suddenly, the once proud Browns were on the other side of the rivalry, watching as Pittsburgh stacked championships and parades. The games between the two weren't just football, they were battles of identity. These were two Rust Belt cities, separated by 2 hours of highway, each reflecting the grit and toughness of industrial America. Cleveland fans carried their civic pride into the rivalry like a badge of honor. Pittsburgh fans, waving their terrible towels, countered with relentless passion. The physicality was unmatched. Browns lineman Doug Deacon once said, "When you played Pittsburgh, you expected bruises." That was part of the deal. It was survival football. The rivalry endured through highs and lows. In 1986, Bernie Kosar led Cleveland to the AFC Championship, only to fall short. In the 1990s, when the Browns were controversially moved to Baltimore, the rivalry seemed threatened. But when the Browns returned in 1999, so did the hatred. The first game back, Pittsburgh spoiled the occasion with a 43-0 demolition. For Browns fans, it was humiliation. For Steelers fans, it was confirmation that the rivalry had never truly left. Even in recent years, with Pittsburgh often the superior team, Cleveland has clung to moments of defiance. In the 2020 playoffs, the Browns stunned the Steelers 48-37 at Heinz Field, their first postseason win since 1994. For Cleveland fans, it was more than a victory, it was catharsis. Decades of frustration released in one glorious night. Rivalries don't need balance to survive, they need passion. And Browns versus Steelers still burns, carrying with it the legacy of two cities that built America's backbone and found meaning in their football wars. From the industrial north, the story shifts southward, where another rivalry was brewing in very different soil. The New Orleans Saints and Atlanta Falcons do not share the same decades-long prestige of Browns versus Steelers. But ask fans in Louisiana or Georgia, and they'll tell you this rivalry is every bit as venomous. The Saints entered the league in 1967, the Falcons a year earlier. Both struggled in their infancy. For years, they were franchises marked by losing, mocked as pretenders in a league dominated by powerhouses. But their proximity created a natural animosity. Just a 6-hour drive down Interstate 85 separated Atlanta and New Orleans. Fans traveled, cultures clashed. The Saints, rooted in the French Quarter, Mardi Gras, and jazz, saw themselves as unique, defiant, and resilient. The Falcons, tied to Atlanta's rising status as a southern metropolis, carried their own pride, their own swagger. As the teams grew, so did the stakes. The rivalry gained true fire in the late 1970s and 1980s, when both franchises began to show flashes of competitiveness. Saints fans still remember November 25, 1979, when Atlanta's Steve Burkowski threw a last-minute touchdown to beat New Orleans 34-30, sparking a wave of heartbreak. Atlanta fans still cherish December 10, 1978, when the Falcons won in the Superdome on a Hail Mary pass, silencing a roaring crowd. These were the games that hardened the rivalry. By the 2000s, when Drew Brees arrived in New Orleans and Michael Vick electrified Atlanta, the feud reached new heights. Brees turned the Saints into a powerhouse, culminating in their Super Bowl 44 victory in 2010. Atlanta countered with Vick's brilliance. Then Matt Ryan's steady rise, leading the Falcons to Super Bowl 51. Every clash between the two was a referendum on supremacy in the NFC South. Saints defensive end Cameron Jordan once quipped, "It doesn't matter what our records are. If it's Falcons week, it's war." The rivalry also carried cultural undertones. Atlanta versus New Orleans was more than a football game, was a battle of cities, of food, music, and identity. Saints fans mocked Atlanta as soulless. Falcons fans derided New Orleans as backward. The banter became part of the rivalry's lore, fueling fan hatred that has lasted for decades. In 2006, when New Orleans returned to the Superdome after Hurricane Katrina, the opponent was Atlanta. The game became one of the most emotional in NFL history. Steve Gleason's blocked punt, which helped spark a Saints victory, is etched forever into league memory. That night was about more than football, it was about rebirth, resilience, and a city rising again. For Falcons fans, it was agony to play foil in their rival's defining moment. For Saints fans, it was destiny. Rivalry, once again, gave the game its weight. When I think about Browns versus Steelers and Saints versus Falcons side by side, I see two rivalries that could not look more different. One is rooted in history, stretching back to black and white broadcasts and the factories of the Midwest. The other is younger, brash, and infused with Southern flavor. One is about blood and tradition, the other about culture and identity. But at their core, they are the same. They are about belonging. They are about proving, year after year, that your city, your colors, your pride cannot be denied. And that is why the NFL's fiercest rivalries endure. Because they are more than games, they are living stories written in touchdowns, interceptions, heartbreaks, and triumphs. They define eras, they define cities, and they remind us that football, at its essence, is about competition sharpened by hate, but sustained by respect. Rivalries can take many shapes. Some are rooted in geography. Some are built on personalities, and some are forged simply because two teams refuse to give way to one another. Year after year, in the same division, under the same spotlight. Batch 9 moves us into two such rivalries. The New York Jets versus the Miami Dolphins, a feud fueled by drama characters and unforgettable moments in the AFC East. And the Denver Broncos versus the San Diego Now. Los Angeles Chargers, a Western clash, is defined by quarterbacks' altitude and the constant fight for legitimacy in a crowded AFC West. The Jets versus Dolphins rivalry may not carry the century-old weight of Bears versus Packers. But for decades, it has been one of the most unpredictable and bitter matchups in football. It began in the 1970s when the Dolphins, coached by Don Shula, rose to power with the NFL's only perfect season in 1972. The Jets, still basking in the glow of Joe Namath's guarantee and upset victory in Super Bowl III, wanted desperately to prove they remained relevant. The games were fierce, often sloppy, always emotional. Dolphins safety Dick Anderson once described it as a street fight disguised as football. The 1980s and 1990s only heightened the animosity. The Monday Night Miracle of 2000 remains one of the rivalry's most unforgettable moments. On October 23rd, in the Meadowlands, the Dolphins held a 32-7 lead with less than 13 minutes remaining in the fourth quarter. For most, the game was over, but the Jets mounted one of the greatest comebacks in NFL history, storming back to win 42-37 in overtime. Vinny Testaverde threw for 378 yards, and Jets fans poured out of the stadium in disbelief. For Dolphins fans, it was a wound that still lingers. Rivalries live in these memories, the moments that cannot be erased, no matter how many seasons pass. The Jets and Dolphins rivalry also became personal because of quarterbacks. Don Marino, Miami's golden-armed leader, shredded New York defenses for years, throwing 72 touchdown passes against them, the most he ever had against any opponent. Jets fans loathed Marino, not just because he beat them, but because he did it with flair, with confidence, with a smirk that seemed to rub salt in their wounds. Later, when Chad Pennington, a longtime Jet, was released by New York in 2008 and signed with Miami, he led the Dolphins to an 11-5 record and an AFC East title, clinched with a win over the Jets in the Meadowlands. That twist of fate added a layer of betrayal, the kind only rivalries can provide. In recent years, the heat has remained. Whether it's Mark Sanchez's Jets battling the Dolphins for playoff spots in the early 2010s, or the rise of Tua Tagovailoa against New York's aggressive defenses, the matchups continue to carry bitterness. Jets fans chant against Miami with the same venom they save for New England. Dolphins fans mock New York's struggles with equal joy. The rivalry thrives because it is lived, week after week, by fan bases who despise each other as much as the teams do. From the humidity of Miami and the chaos of New York, we travel westward to the thin air of Denver and the sunlit stadiums of San Diego and Los Angeles. The Broncos versus Chargers rivalry is different, less about cultural hatred, more about football supremacy in the AFC West. Yet it has produced its share of drama, fire, and unforgettable clashes. The rivalry was shaped in the 1970s and 80s, when both franchises fought for recognition in a division dominated by the Oakland Raiders. The Chargers had Dan Fouts, one of the greatest quarterbacks never to win a Super Bowl, leading their Air Coryell offense. The Broncos countered with the Orange Crush defense, anchored by Randy Gradisher. The games were shootouts versus slugfests, two identities colliding in a battle for relevance. Then came John Elway. From the mid-1980s through the 1990s, Elway defined the Broncos and tormented the Chargers. His cannon arm and late-game heroics turned Denver into perennial contenders, while San Diego struggled to find consistency. Still, there were moments. In 1994, the Chargers reached the Super Bowl, knocking off Kansas City and Pittsburgh along the way. They carried that banner of divisional pride. But even then, the shadow of Denver loomed. The 2000s brought new fire, thanks to quarterbacks once again. On one side, Philip Rivers fiery, emotional, trash-talking, unafraid to jaw at opponents. On the other, Jay Cutler, then Kyle Orton, and eventually Peyton Manning. Rivers despised Denver, and Denver despised Rivers. Their clashes were memorable, not just for the plays, but for the personalities. In 2008, a blown call in Denver allowed the Broncos to beat the Chargers 39-38, after a late fumble was incorrectly ruled dead. San Diego fans seethed with anger, and Rivers never forgot it. When Peyton Manning arrived in Denver in 2012, the rivalry reached new heights. Manning and Rivers dueling for division crowns became an annual spectacle. The 2013 AFC Divisional Round saw Denver beat San Diego 24-17, with Manning throwing for 230 yards to secure a path to the Super Bowl. For Rivers, it was heartbreak again. For Denver fans, it was proof of supremacy. Even after Rivers departed, the rivalry remained. Justin Herbert's arrival in Los Angeles brought new energy. His rocket arm and composure tested Denver's defenses, while Broncos fans clung to the legacy of Elway and Manning, demanding their team rise again. Every Chargers versus Broncos game feels like a battle for respect, a chance to prove which franchise can carry the AFC West torch against the might of Kansas City. What ties Jets versus Dolphins and Broncos versus Chargers together is the way rivalries evolve through eras. They are not static. They are not relics. They are living, breathing contests, fueled by geography, quarterbacks, coaches, and moments of heartbreak or joy that fans never forget. In Miami, fans still talk about the Monday Night Miracle. In New York, Marino's smirk still burns. In Denver, Rivers' jawing and Manning's dominance remain fresh memories. In Los Angeles, every win over Denver feels like validation, a reminder that the Chargers are not just an afterthought. Rivalries thrive because they carry history forward. The Jets and Dolphins, the Broncos and Chargers, they remind us that football is not just about trophies. It is about grudges. It is about scars. It is about proving, again and again, that your team is better, your city is stronger, your pride is unbroken. Some rivalries in the NFL are fought on grass and turf, but they live far beyond the field. They become cultural battles, generational inheritances, and emotional scars that outlast the final whistle. Two of the most defining rivalries of the modern era stand as proof of this truth. The brutal trench war between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens, and the glamorous, dynasty-shaping clash of the Dallas Cowboys and the San Francisco 49ers. Together, they represent two sides of the same coin, one soaked in blood and grit, the other gilded with star power and destiny. The Steelers versus Ravens rivalry didn't take long to become one of the NFL's fiercest. When the Cleveland Browns relocated to Baltimore in 1996. Reborn as the Ravens, they entered the AFC Central and immediately collided with the Steelers. From the beginning, these matchups felt different. There was no easing in, no gradual buildup. The games were violent, suffocating, and defined by defense. Pittsburgh was already a blue-collar city with football stitched into its veins. Baltimore, newly armed with a franchise, was eager to carve out its own identity. What better way than by trying to take down the toughest team in the division? The early years gave us a glimpse, but the 2000s cemented the rivalry's legend. The Ravens' defense, led by Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, and Terrell Suggs, became one of the most feared units in NFL history. The Steelers countered with Troy Polamalu, James Harrison, and Joey Porter, creating collisions that were less about schemes and more about raw survival. These weren't shootouts, they were street fights. Between 2000 and 2010, 17 of their 23 matchups were decided by a touchdown or less. Quotes from the players only deepened the mythos. Bart Scott, the Ravens linebacker, once said, "It's not football, it's organized crime." Hines Ward, Pittsburgh's relentless wide receiver, became a villain in Baltimore, with his bone-crushing blocks sparking outrage and admiration alike. Ward even broke a jaw with one of his infamous crackback blocks, and Ravens fans never forgot. The playoffs turned the rivalry into legend. In the 2008 AFC Championship, Pittsburgh secured a trip to the Super Bowl with a 23-14 victory, sealed by Polamalu's iconic 40-yard interception return. That single play, his long hair streaming as he weaved across the field, felt like destiny. Baltimore answered in 2015 when Joe Flacco and the Ravens stunned Pittsburgh. 32-17 at Heinz Field in a wild-card game. For every blow, there was an answer. For every heartbreak, there was revenge. What made it different from other rivalries was the shared identity. Both teams played the same brand of football. Defense first, punishing run games. Quarterbacks who could take punishment. Ben Roethlisberger was sacked over 70 times by the Ravens in his career, more than any other opponent. Terrell Suggs once joked, "I'd probably hug him if I didn't spend so much time trying to break him." And still, there was respect. Ray Lewis admitted late in his career that no games meant more to him than Pittsburgh week. Contrast that with Cowboys versus 49ers, and you see a completely different picture. If Steelers versus Ravens was mud and bruises, Cowboys versus 49ers was bright lights and legacies. Their story begins in the 1970s, when Dallas, led by Tom Landry and Roger Staubach, regularly denied San Francisco a path to the Super Bowl. In back-to-back NFC championships in 1970 and 1971, the Cowboys ended the 49ers' dreams. The wounds festered in San Francisco, but by the early 1980s, the script flipped. The 49ers, armed with Joe Montana, Dwight Clark, and coach Bill Walsh, rewrote football with the West Coast offense. In the 1981 NFC Championship, the rivalry produced one of the NFL's most iconic moments, the catch. Montana rolled right, pump-faked, and lofted the ball to Clark, who soared high in the back of the end zone. That play didn't just beat Dallas 28-27. It announced a new era. The Cowboys dynasty was fading, and San Francisco was on the rise. Then came the 1990s trilogy, a three-year run where Dallas and San Francisco met in the NFC. Championship every season from 1992 to 1994. These games weren't just football. They were battles for league supremacy. The Cowboys, powered by Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin, won in 1992 and 1993. Their balance of power football crushed San Francisco's hopes. But in 1994, Steve Young and Jerry Rice struck back, defeating Dallas and winning the Super Bowl. The emotional weight was massive. Young finally emerged from Montana's shadow, and San Francisco exercised years of frustration. Deion Sanders added gasoline to the fire. In 1994, he joined the 49ers and helped shut down Dallas. The next year, he switched sides, signing with the Cowboys. It was betrayal for some, redemption for others. Few players symbolize a rivalry like Sanders, a Hall of Famer whose presence shifted the balance of power in consecutive years. Even in the modern era, Cowboys versus 49ers refuses to fade. In the 2021, 2022, and 2023 playoffs, San Francisco eliminated Dallas in 3 consecutive seasons. Dak Prescott's interceptions, stalled drives, and struggles against the 49ers became national talking points. For Cowboys fans, it was the same story. Heartbreak at the hands of San Francisco. For Niners fans, it was legacy renewed, continuation of the dominance forged in the 1980s and 1990s. The cultural stakes make this rivalry unique. Dallas carries the weight of being America's team, with unmatched visibility and scrutiny. San Francisco represents the golden standard, the model of innovation and consistent excellence. When they meet, it feels less like a game and more like a referendum on what greatness looks like. Taken together, these two rivalries embody the NFL's emotional extremes. Steelers versus Ravens is raw, visceral, and violent a rivalry where the scars are physical. Cowboys versus 49ers is polished, star-studded, and defining where the scars are etched into legacy and national narrative. Both remind us why rivalries matter. In Pittsburgh and Baltimore, fans live for the bruises. The defense-first identity, the sense that victory means proving your toughness. In Dallas and San Francisco, fans live for glory, for proving their team belongs at the summit of the sport. Whether it's Ray Lewis staring down Ben Roethlisberger or Montana staring down Staubach, these rivalries are more than games. They are living history. The beauty of the NFL lies in this duality. The mud and the lights. The blood and the glamour. The Ravens and Steelers battering each other into submission, while the Cowboys and 49ers dazzle under the bright stage of championship football. Both, in their own way, prove that rivalries are not simply about who wins and loses. They are about how teams define themselves through the battles they fight and the enemies they can never quite forget. Rivalries in football are not always born from proximity. Sometimes they erupt from pride, ego, and the stubborn refusal to back down. Few rivalries demonstrate this more vividly than the long-standing war between the Oakland Raiders and Kansas City Chiefs, and the newer but equally venomous clash between the Seattle Seahawks and San Francisco 49ers. Together, they capture two different eras of hatred, one forged in the wild chaos of the AFL, the other crafted in the tactical battles of the modern NFL. The Raiders versus Chiefs rivalry stretches back to the very birth of professional football's merger era. In the 1960s, the American Football League was still carving out space against the NFL. The Raiders and Chiefs represented two clashing philosophies. Kansas City, under the brilliant mind of Coach Hank Stram, prided itself on organization, discipline, and precision. Oakland, led by Al Davis, embodied rebellion. They were brash, unapologetic, and determined to outmuscle anyone in their way. It was inevitable that these two franchises would come to despise one another. From 1966 through 1969, the Chiefs and Raiders were the class of the AFL. Oakland won 13 straight games against Kansas City during one stretch, including a 41-6 beatdown in 1968 that still echoes in rivalry lore. But Kansas City landed the ultimate counterpunch. In the 1969 AFL Championship game, the Chiefs stunned the Raiders 17-7, denying them a Super Bowl appearance and cementing their own path to victory in Super Bowl IV. That loss gnawed at the Raiders' psyche, fueling decades of bitterness. What made this rivalry different was the violence. These weren't just competitive games, they were personal. Ben Davidson, the Raiders' fearsome defensive end, became infamous for late hits on Chiefs quarterback Len Dawson. Their clashes were brutal enough that fights often spilled over after the whistle. For fans, it was just football. It was tribal warfare between Oakland's Renegades and Kansas City's disciplined Warriors. The 1970s and 1980s kept the fire alive. John Madden's Raiders teams embraced the outlaw image, winning Super Bowls with swagger. The Chiefs, though often outmatched during those decades, still relished every chance to spoil Oakland's season. The games were unpredictable, emotional, and filled with grudges that never seemed to fade. even into the 1990s, when Marcus Allen, once a Raiders legend, signed with the Chiefs. The rivalry gained new venom. Allen's bitter feud with Al Davis added personal drama to an already toxic matchup. Kansas City fans saw him as redemption. Raiders fans saw betrayal. Today, the Raiders and Chiefs exist in different worlds of success. Kansas City, led by Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid, has become the NFL's new dynasty, while the Raiders struggle for stability in Las Vegas. Yet, whenever they meet, the echoes of the past remain. Raiders fans still remember the bruises, the cheap shots, the bitterness. Chiefs fans still savor their place as the thorn that has forever been in Oakland's side. Even in blowouts, the rivalry feels alive because history demands it. If Raiders versus Chiefs was about rebellion versus order, then Seahawks versus 49ers is about pride versus innovation. This rivalry, newer in comparison, emerged in the 2000s but exploded in the early 2010s into one of the NFL's most heated modern feuds. The Seahawks and 49ers weren't always divisional foes. Seattle joined the NFC West in 2002 during the NFL's realignment. For the first few years, the games were one-sided. San Francisco, struggling after the glory days of the 1980s and 1990s, faded into mediocrity. Seattle, under Mike Holmgren and later Pete Carroll, slowly built itself into a contender. By the time Jim Harbaugh arrived in San Francisco in 2011, the rivalry was ready to ignite. Harbaugh versus Carroll was personal. The two had already clashed in college when Harbaugh's Stanford teams beat Carroll's USC squads. Carroll famously barked at Harbaugh on the sideline, "What's your deal?" The animosity carried straight into the NFL. Carroll's Seahawks were young, brash, and fast. Harbaugh's 49ers were tough, physical, and disciplined. Neither coach would give an inch. The quarterback duel mirrored the coaches' personalities. RussellWilson.com, efficient and dangerous in key moments, led Seattle. Colin Kaepernick, dynamic, electrifying, and bold, carried San Francisco. Their games were heavyweight bouts, decided not by finesse, but by sheer will. The pinnacle came in the 2013 NFC Championship game, perhaps the greatest chapter in the rivalry. Seattle trailed late when Wilson launched a pass to Jermaine Kearse, sparking a comeback. With 22 seconds left, Kaepernick fired a pass to Michael Crabtree in the end zone, but Richard Sherman tipped it away, sealing the game. Sherman's post-game interview became instantly iconic. "I'm the best corner in the game. When you try me with a sorry receiver like Crabtree, that's the result you're gonna get." It wasn't just trash talk. It was a declaration that Seattle had seized control of the division. That win propelled the Seahawks to their first Super Bowl title. For 49ers fans, it was heartbreak a chance at another Lombardi ripped away by their most hated rival. For Seahawks fans, it was validation. The balance of power had shifted. Even after Harbaugh's departure, the rivalry stayed relevant. The 49ers rebuilt under Kyle Shanahan, crafting an offense as creative as Bill Walsh's West Coast system decades earlier. The Seahawks transitioned into Wilson's prime years. Each meeting carried meaning. In 2019, the 49ers won an overtime thriller in Seattle that decided the NFC West. In 2022 and 2023, San Francisco eliminated Seattle from playoff contention, reasserting dominance. What makes Seahawks versus 49ers different from other rivalries is the cultural clash. Seattle embraced the Legion of Boom, a defense that thrived on intimidation and swagger. San Francisco leaned on traditions of precision, innovation, and history. The fan bases reflected this. Seahawks fans, the 12s, brought deafening noise to every game. 49ers fans carried decades of legacy, banners, and a sense of entitlement to greatness. When they collided, it was more than a football game. It was a collision of values, pride, and the right to own the NFC West. Together, these two rivalries tell a broader story about the NFL. Raiders versus Chiefs shows us how bitterness can last across generations, how grudges from the 1960s still shape the way fan bases feel today. Seahawks vs. 49ers shows us how rivalries can emerge overnight, sparked by coaches, personalities, and playoff stakes, then burn as brightly as any legacy feud. Both prove that rivalries need to be built solely on geography, can be forged through betrayal, heartbreak, and the refusal to bow to a rival's dominance. In Kansas City and Oakland, fans still chant, "Boo," and roar as if Ben Davidson and Len Dawson are still trading blows. In Seattle and San Francisco, fans replay Sherman's tipped pass or Kaepernick's runs as if they happened yesterday. These rivalries are alive because they mean more than football. They are reminders of pride defended, of humiliation endured, and of enemies who will never be forgotten. When I think about the rivalries that define the middle stretch of modern football, I can't help but see them as more than games. They were like collisions of ideology, philosophy, and identity. By the time the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, the NFL was no longer just a collection of regional loyalties, it was a national stage. And on that stage, certain clashes defined not just seasons, but eras. The Chicago Bears against the Green Bay Packers had long been the historical backbone. But another duel emerged to capture a younger generation's attention. The Patriots against the Colts. Brady versus Manning. Cold precision versus relentless fire. And when you mix these storylines, the ancient against the modern, you begin to see how. Rivalries serve as the bloodstream of the league, carrying its memories, its wounds, and its triumphs. Green Bay and Chicago represent the NFL's roots. Their rivalry is older than many American institutions. A thread that connects the earliest days of leather helmets to the spectacle of today's billion-dollar broadcasts. Every autumn, their games became a chance for fans to declare something larger. That tradition still mattered. That history had weight. The Bears, with their bruising identity built on defense and toughness, carried the aura of George Halas, Mike Ditka, and Walter Payton. The Packers, anchored by the frozen tundra of Lambeau, embodied resilience, community ownership, and an unshakable devotion that transcended wins and losses. When those teams met, it was as if the sport itself was reminding everyone of where it came from. Yet, in the early 2000s, a new rivalry claimed the spotlight. Peyton Manning's Colts and Tom Brady's Patriots collided in games that weren't about nostalgia, they were about evolution. Manning brought the surgeon's touch, diagnosing defenses with encyclopedic recall, calling plays at the line like a maestro conducting a symphony. Brady brought poise under pressure, a quiet ferocity, and the ability to bend entire games to his will in the final minutes. Their duels weren't just contests, they were chess matches played at full speed, with Super Bowl berths often hanging in the balance. But what makes these rivalries fascinating is not simply the action on the field, it is the human dimension beneath them. Brett Favre versus the Bears was as much about his reckless, gunslinger heart as it was about Green Bay's dominance. Every time he dropped back, fans on both sides felt that cocktail of hope and dread. Would he deliver magic or disaster? Manning, by contrast, carried the burden of perfectionism. He shouldered the narrative of playoff failures year after year, while Brady and Bill Belichick seemed to find a way to win with less. Those storylines weren't abstract, they were lived realities for the players. Manning once admitted, "You feel like every game against New England defines your legacy." That pressure doesn't go away. And rivalries aren't confined to players. They bleed into the cultures of their cities, into the psychology of the fans. In Chicago, beating the Packers was almost a civic duty. People wore those wins like armor against the long winters. In Green Bay, triumph over the Bears validated not just the team, but the very idea that a small town could stand shoulder to shoulder with America's biggest markets. Meanwhile, in Indianapolis, each loss to New England stung with the weight of being a smaller franchise dismissed by the powerhouse of Foxborough. The victories, when they came, felt like proof that persistence could topple even dynasties. The emotional toll on players in these rivalries is harder to measure, but no less real. Rivalries force repetition of pressure, magnified by memory. A regular loss might sting for a week, but losing to a rival lingers for years. Just ask Brian Urlacher, who admitted after retirement, "The games against Green Bay stick with me more than any other. Those were the ones you circled, the ones you carried on your shoulders." For Manning, finally breaking through against Brady in the 2006 AFC Championship wasn't just a victory, it was liberation. The shedding of years of doubt. Looking back, what I find striking is how rivalries expose the duality of greatness. They build legends, but they also create wounds that never fully heal. Favreau's late career interceptions against Chicago still haunt Green Bay fans. Brady's near-perfect season, undone not by Manning, but by the Giants, is framed in part by his rivalry with Peyton, because people expected destiny to favor him in every moment. Rivalries amplify everything. They make triumph euphoric, but they make failure unforgiving. It's easy to romanticize rivalries as pure competition, but they often reveal the harsher truths of the league. Manning himself once described the New England defense of the early 2000s as borderline brutal, in how they handled receivers an approach so physical it forced the league to adjust its enforcement of rules. That adjustment, ironically, shifted the balance of power in Manning's favor. In that sense, rivalries don't just create drama, they literally change the sport. They expose flaws in fairness, in officiating, in preparation. They force the league to evolve. Whether it's altering defensive pass interference calls or reconsidering how to protect quarterbacks from unrelenting pressure. What ties the Bears-Packers and Patriots-Colts sagas together is how they reveal two sides of the NFL's identity, tradition, and reinvention. Chicago and Green Bay remind us that football's roots are embedded in physicality, loyalty, and endurance. Brady and Manning showed us that precision, innovation, and mental warfare could define a generation. Together, they underscore that the NFL is not static. It is a living organism shaped by its rivalries, always balancing what was with what could be. And when I reflect on these rivalries, I see something beyond wins and losses. I see how they gave fans meaning in uncertain times. The Packers beating the Bears during the economic downturn of the 1980s was more than a scoreboard. It was resilience for a community. Manning's eventual triumph over Brady gave hope to those who knew what it felt like to fail repeatedly before finally breaking through. These are not just sports stories, they are human stories. They are the reasons we invest so much of ourselves into games that, on paper, are just numbers. Even now, the echoes remain. A Bears fan doesn't simply say they want to beat Green Bay, they say they need it. A Patriots fan doesn't just recall championships. They recall Manning's face after another playoff loss, the validation that their dynasty was unshakable. And Colts fans, to this day, tell the story of 2006 as if it were yesterday, because it wasn't just a win, it was redemption. This is the power of rivalries. They create history, they rewrite narratives, and they linger long after the players have left the field. Rivalries remind us that football is not only about who is better, it's about who matters more in the moments that define everything. And that, perhaps, is why when legends collide off the field, in interviews, in memories, in reflections, the rivalries still feel alive, because in truth, they never end. Rivalries are never just about the players on the field. They are about the eras they define, the identities they carve into the sport's DNA. By the time the 2000s matured, and the Patriots-Colts duels were cementing themselves in the public consciousness, another battle simmered in the background, one that carried echoes of the past while shaping the future. It was the Cowboys against the 49ers, two titans whose clashes in the 1990s had already been legendary, but whose legacies continue to shadow the league into the new century. To understand these rivalries is to understand how football itself transitions from one epoch to another. When Dallas met San Francisco in the early to mid-1990s, it wasn't just football, was spectacle. On one side, Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, and Michael Irvin represented a machine-like efficiency, fueled by the swagger of America's team. On the other, Steve Young, Jerry Rice, and a franchise still echoing Joe Montana's greatness symbolized precision, innovation, and grace. Their meetings in the NFC Championship were more than games. They were gateways to the Super Bowl. Whoever won that battle often ruled the football world. For fans who lived through it, those clashes left scars and memories that lasted decades. But rivalries don't die when players retire. They linger, waiting for new faces to step into old shadows. By the 2000s, when Tony Romo tried to resurrect the Cowboys' fortunes and the 49ers cycled through quarterbacks searching for stability, the intensity might have dimmed, but the ghost of the rivalry remained. Every meeting carried with it whispers of Aikman versus Young, of Rice against Deion Sanders, of dynasties colliding at their peak. It is in these whispers that the NFL's mythology is kept alive. The Colts-Patriots rivalry, though fresher, carried a similar weight of inevitability. If Dallas San Francisco owned the 1990s, then Brady and Manning ruled the 2000s. The AFC Championship became their proving ground, just as the NFC title had once been the Cowboys and 49ers domain. What strikes me, looking back, is how the NFL always seems to find its dueling giants, two forces destined to clash until one breaks the other. It's not coincidence. It's the natural order of a sport that thrives on narrative tension. What made Brady-Manning so compelling was how different they were, not just as quarterbacks, but as personalities. Manning was meticulous, almost obsessive, controlling every variable he could. Brady, especially in his early years, seemed defined by resilience, thriving when everything looked impossible. When they met, it was not only about who had the better arm or the sharper mind, it was about which philosophy would prevail. Was greatness built on preparation or adaptability, on overwhelming talent or on outlasting your opponent in the final minutes? Each game gave a different answer, which is why the rivalry never grew stale. Contrast that with the Bears-Packers, where history itself became the storyline. When Brett Favre was replaced by Aaron Rodgers, the rivalry didn't fade, it transformed. Rodgers brought an icy precision, a surgeon's calm, almost the opposite of Favreau's reckless spirit. Chicago, meanwhile, cycled through quarterbacks, each one compared to the legends of the past, none quite able to carry the torch. Yet every matchup still carried the same charge. Fans didn't watch simply for the standings, they watched for pride, for legacy, for the chance to either uphold or disrupt decades of tradition. And then there were rivalries that transcended even football itself, rivalries that became cultural markers. Consider the Raiders against the Chiefs, a feud steeped in animosity since the days of the old AFL. Al Davis built the Raiders in his own rebellious image, clashing not just with Kansas City, but with the entire league. Two Raiders fans beating the Chiefs wasn't just about football, was about defiance. Two Chiefs fans. Triumph over Oakland was vindication against chaos. That rivalry, in its rawest form, is football stripped down to pure emotion, hatred, pride, and the catharsis of victory. The human element in all these rivalries cannot be overstated. Rivalries push players beyond normal limits. They play through injuries, they absorb criticism, and they carry the weight of expectation that most people could never endure. Terrell Owens, who found himself at the center of both the Cowboys and the 49ers at different points, once said, "When you play in those games, you're not just representing your team, you're carrying a legacy. And if you mess it up, fans don't forget." That pressure can forge greatness, but it can also break players under its weight. What fascinates me is how rivalries also expose the hidden systems beneath the game. The Patriots' dominance over the Colts in the early 2000s was not just about Brady's poison, was about Belichick's schemes, his ability to exploit weaknesses, his use of disguised coverages to rattle Manning at the line. The Bears-Packers wasn't just about quarterback sit, was about Chicago's defensive traditions clashing with Green Bay's offensive evolution. Rivalries are chess matches, yes, but they are also laboratories where strategies are tested, refined, and copied across the league. And yet, despite the tactical brilliance, what we remember are the moments. Dwight Clark's the catch in 1982 against the Cowboys. Manning's comeback against the Patriots in the 2006 AFC Championship. Rodgers' Hail Marys that broke hearts in Chicago. These moments live on because rivalries amplify them. If Clark had made that catch against any other team, it might have been just another highlight. But against Dallas, it became myth. Rivalries also mirror the passage of time. They show us how eras end and how new ones begin. The Cowboys-49ers rivalry gave way to the Patriots-Colts. Brady and Manning's duels gave way to Brady against Patrick Mahomes. Every generation gets its giants, and every rivalry becomes a bridge to the next. For fans, these bridges are how we connect with the past while embracing the future. They are how a grandfather tells his grandson about Bart Starr or Roger Staubach, while the grandson counters with stories of Brady or Manning. Rivalries are the glue that binds those conversations. But the darker side of rivalries cannot be ignored. The pressure to win against a rival often pushes teams to dangerous extremes. Players are asked to play through concussions, through torn ligaments, through injuries that could change their lives forever, all because the game matters more. Manning once admitted that he played through pain in certain matchups simply because losing to Brady felt unbearable. That's the hidden cost of these spectacles, the sacrifice of health for the sake of legacy. In the end, what I've come to realize is that rivalries are not just the heartbeat of football, they are its conscience. They remind us why the sport matters, why we care, why we remember. They show us the beauty of competition, but they also reveal its cruelty. They give us moments of joy that last a lifetime, but they also leave scars on players that never heal. And maybe that's the point. Rivalries are not meant to be clean. They are meant to be raw, emotional, unforgettable. When I look at the history of the NFL, I see it not as a straight line, but as a series of collisions. Bears and Packers, Cowboys and 49ers, Patriots and Colts, Raiders and Chiefs. Each collision leaves its mark, shaping the sport for the next generation. And as new rivalries emerge, Moms versus Burrow, Bills against Chiefs, we know that the cycle continues. Because football without rivalries is just a game. With them, it becomes something much greater. A story worth telling. A memory worth keeping. A fight worth watching forever. Some rivalries feel like traditions, passed down from generation to generation, etched into family gatherings and neighborhood arguments. Others feel like betrayals, sudden ruptures that leave scars for years. In the NFL, both kinds endure, and nowhere are they more evident than in the Giants against the Eagles and the Patriots against the Jets. Two rivalries separated by geography, style, and history, yet bound by the same truth. Some games are never just games. They are battles for identity, for pride, for survival in the eyes of fans who carry grudges longer than players' careers. The Giants and the Eagles are not simply rivals, they are neighbors locked in perpetual disdain. Since the 1930s, these two franchises have faced each other over 180 times, creating one of the longest-running blood feuds in football. New York, with its metropolitan swagger and history of championships, has always carried the air of the established power. Philadelphia, gritty and bruising, has lived to prove it can punch just as hard, if not harder. This isn't just NFC East football, it as a cultural clash between cities that see themselves as opposites. The early years of the rivalry were marked by the Eagles clawing their way into legitimacy. In the 1940s, Coach Greasy Neal and halfback Steve Van Buren helped Philadelphia finally topple the Giants en route to back-to-back NFL championships. That lit the fuse for decades of bitterness. But the Eagles' most enduring statement came in 1960, when they handed Vince Lombardi's Packers their only playoff loss, cementing Philadelphia's tough underdog identity. Giants fans seethed, but they knew the Eagles were now permanent thorns in their side. By the 1980s, the rivalry reached a cruel intensity. In 1981, Giants linebacker Lawrence Taylor was drafted, revolutionizing defense and terrorizing quarterbacks. For Philadelphia, who already despised New York, Taylor became the symbol of everything they loathed: dominance in blue and white. In 1988, on a cold December afternoon, Eagles fans reveled in one of the rivalry's most notorious moments. The Fog Bowl playoff win against Chicago was still to come, but before that, they watched their team break the Giants' playoff hopes. Fans poured vitriol over their rivals, and a tradition of hostility that stretched from Veterans Stadium to the Meadowlands became gospel. And then there was the miracle at the Meadowlands, twice. In 1978, when Herman Edwards scooped up a Giants fumble and ran it back for a last-second touchdown, the rivalry achieved folklore status. New York collapsed, Philadelphia rejoiced, and bitterness turned into pure hatred. Decades later, in 2010, DC and Jackson's walk-off punt returnal at the Meadowlands delivered another miracle, another humiliation, and another scar that Giants fans still carry. These moments transcend football. They're chapters of civic identity, talked about in barbershops, family kitchens, and tailgates. If Giants-Eagles is a rivalry of tradition, Patriots-Jets is one of betrayal. It isn't as old as Giants-Eagles, but it's just as venomous. It begins with geography: New England against New York with the shared AFC East. But its real fire comes from one man, Bill Belichick. In January 2000, Belichick was named head coach of the Jets. Just one day later, he resigned with a handwritten note: "I resign as HC of the NYJ." That stunning act sent him to New England, where he would join Tom Brady to form the most successful dynasty in NFL history. For Jets fans, it wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. For Patriots fans, it was destiny. From that moment on, every Jets-Patriots game carried undertones of bitterness, of what if, of the man who got away. On the field, the rivalry became brutal. In 2001, the Patriots lost quarterback Drew Bledsoe to a crushing hit by Jets linebacker Mo Lewis. That injury ushered in Brady's career. Jets fans saw it as their moment of influence on history. Patriots fans saw it as fate. From then on, Brady tormented New York with surgical precision, compiling a record that made the Jets seem cursed. But the Jets fought back. In 2009, under coach Rex Ryan, they beat the Patriots in Foxborough in a playoff stunner. Bart Scott's post-game declaration, "Can't wait," became the rallying cry of defiance. Yet even in victory, New York lived in New England's shadow. The Patriots always found a way to reassert dominance, winning division title after division title, while the Jets languished in mediocrity. The frustration deepened, the hatred grew. These two rivalries, Giants-Eagles and Patriots-Jets, show us two sides of the same coin. Giants-Eagles is generational, woven into the DNA of families. Patriots-Jets is more personal, born from betrayal and magnified by dynasty. But both remind us why rivalries matter, because they take football beyond the field and into the realm of memory, identity, and emotion. When Giants and Eagles players take the field, they don't just wear uniforms, they carry decades of animosity. The weight of miracle at the Meadowlands, the echoes of Taylor's sacks and Jackson's return. When Patriots and Jets line up, it's not just Brady versus whoever New York puts under center. It's Belichick's betrayal, Rex Ryan's bravado, and every fan who feels the sting of unfinished business. I've always believed rivalries reveal the true cost of the game. They push players to play harder, to endure pain, to chase legacy even when it risks their health. Rivalries make coaches innovate, fan bases harden, and moments become myths. But they also demand sacrifices of bodies, of reputations, of sanity. For the Eagles, beating the Giants is proof of grit. For the Giants, stopping the Eagles is validation of history. For the Patriots, beating the Jets is about proving superiority. For the Jets, toppling New England even just once is about proving they exist. These are not just games. They are trials carried out in front of millions, where failure lingers longer than success. Rivalries, more than championships, are what fans remember, because championships are shared with the whole league. Rivalries, those belong only to you and your enemy. And so, from the roars of Lincoln Financial Field to the cold winds of Foxborough, from the Meadowlands to the Meadowbrook Parkway, these rivalries endure. They remind us that football is more than strategy, more than numbers, more than even the Lombardi Trophy. It is about who you beat and how long your people will remember it. Some rivalries come to define entire eras. Others emerge suddenly in bursts of brilliance and heartbreak, reshaping the present and hinting at the future. To close this journey through the NFL's fiercest collisions, it feels fitting to look at both ends of that spectrum. The Washington versus Cowboys rivalry, a battle as old as modern football itself, and the Chiefs versus Bills rivalry. A rivalry still young, but already echoing with the weight of history. Together, they capture what rivalries truly are: timeless struggles that stretch across decades, while simultaneously renewing themselves with each new generation. The Washington Cowboys feud began with geography and ambition, but quickly became something more. Dallas, founded in 1960 as the NFL's expansion team, sought legitimacy fast. Washington, already an established franchise, had long claimed the South as its fan base. When Dallas arrived, Washington's owner, George Preston Marshall, refused to allow games to air in his territory. To him, the Cowboys were intruders, threatening not just his team, but his cultural monopoly. It was business at first, but soon it was personal. The clashes of the 1970s cemented the rivalry's legend. Dallas, under coach Tom Landry, built the famous Doomsday Defense and captured 2 Super Bowls. Washington, led by coach George Allen and later Joe Gibbs, built a dynasty of its own. When they met, it was not just for bragging rights, which was for control of the NFC East and the right to represent the conference on football as biggest stage. The games were physical, bruising, and emotional. Players spoke of the hatred openly. Cowboys running back Walt Garrison once quipped that he'd break his leg in a game so long as it meant beating Washington. Rivalries don't get purer than that. For fans, the hatred ran even deeper. Washington supporters saw Dallas as artificial, glitzy, America's team in name, but not in soul. Cowboys fans saw Washington as bitter, obsessed, unable to match their glamour. The animosity spilled into stadiums, tailgates, living rooms. Thanksgiving games became national stages for the feud, with millions watching not just for football, but for the drama of 2 rivals unwilling to concede anything. Moments defined the rivalry. In 1982, Washington beat Dallas in the NFC Championship, a victory that propelled them to their first Super Bowl title under Gibbs. In the early 1990s, the Cowboys struck back, dominating the NFC East en route to 3 Lombardi trophies in 4 years. The balance of power shifted, but the intensity never wavered. Every era seemed to produce another flashpoint. A crushing hit, a late touchdown, a bitter war of words. And even as fortunes shifted, Washington struggling in the 2000s. Dallas wrestling with its own identity after the Aikman-Nervin-Smith era, the rivalry never dimmed. Fans still circled those dates on the calendar. Players still knew those games mattered differently. Rivalries don't disappear with changing rosters. They survive because memory keeps them alive. For Washington fans, beating Dallas was salvation. For Cowboys fans, crushing Washington was validation. It was, and remains, a fight for something larger than standings. If Washington Cowboys represents the timeless, Chiefs-Bills represents the new frontier. It is not just a rivalry, it is a promise of the NFL's future. And like all great rivalries, it was born not from casual games, but from heartbreak on the biggest stage. January 23, 2022. The AFC Divisional Playoff. Chiefs versus Bills at Arrowhead Stadium. It was the kind of game that felt larger than life, the kind of clash that instantly etched itself into NFL lore. Josh Allen, Buffalo's quarterback, threw 2 go-ahead touchdowns in the final minutes, including a 27-yard strike to Gabriel Davis with just 13 seconds left. 13 seconds. For most teams, that would be the end. But Patrick Mahomes is not most quarterbacks. In 2 plays, he drove the Chiefs into field goal range. Harrison Butker tied the game. In overtime, Kansas City won, leaving Buffalo stunned. That night, fans knew they had witnessed more than just a game. They had seen the birth of a rivalry. Allen and Mahomes, 2 young superstars, had turned football into theater, giving the sport one of its greatest modern duels. For Buffalo fans, it was deja vuing another heartbreaking chapter to add 2 decades of near misses and curses. For Kansas City, it was affirmation that they had found their new dynasty. But what makes Chiefs-Bills more than just a memorable game is how it has repeated itself over and over in different forms. In 2020, the Chiefs beat the Bills in the AFC Championship, keeping Buffalo from the Super Bowl. In 2021, the Bills returned the favor in the regular season, a statement that they were not going away. In 2022, the 13 seconds game deepened the scar. Each matchup since has carried the weight of those memories. What's striking is how different these 2 rivalries feel, yet how deeply they resonate in the same way. Washington versus Cowboys is about tradition, about decades of hatred passed down like family heirlooms. Chiefs versus Bills is about the present and the future, about 2 teams destined to clash as long as Allen and Mahomes share the same era. One is rooted in history, the other in destiny. Together, they show us how rivalries span the arc of time. In both, the emotional stakes are what set them apart. For Washington fans, nothing redeems a losing season like beating Dallas. For Buffalo fans, nothing will erase the sting of 13 seconds until they finally conquer Kansas City in January. Rivalries remind us that football is not just about trophies. It's about scars, about grudges, about the moments that refuse to fade. Even the styles of play reflect the rivalries. Washington-Dallas has always been about physicality, about trench warfare, about punishing defense and pride. Chiefs-Bills is about fireworks quarterbacks with cannons for arms, fences that can score in seconds, duels that feel like heavyweight prize fights. One is mud and grit, the other is speed and brilliance. But both produce unforgettable theater. What makes Chiefs-Bills especially fascinating is how it ties back to the ghosts of history. Buffalo, haunted by its 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses in the early 1990s, carries a collective longing that transcends generations. Kansas City, once a powerhouse of the AFL and Super Bowl IV champions, spent decades in obscurity before Mahomes arrived. Now, they stand as the standard-bearer. For Buffalo to ascend, they must topple Kansas City, just as Washington once had to topple Dallas to prove themselves. History, it seems, always repeats itself, even if the names change. As I reflect on these rivalries, I see the full spectrum of what makes football so uniquely powerful. The past and the future, the scars and the hopes, the grudges that never die and the ones just being born. Washington-Cowboys reminds us that rivalries are about memory. Chiefs-Bills reminds us that rivalries are about promise. Together, they remind us that the NFL is not just a league of teams, but a league of enemies, bound forever by the moments that define them. Because in the end, rivalries are what we carry with us. Trophies are celebrated, then forgotten by those outside the winning city. Records are broken, stats fade, but rivalries live on. Washington fans still talk about Cowboys games from the 1970s. Buffalo fans still replay 13 seconds in their minds with equal parts awe and agony. These are the stories we tell, the stories that never leave us. And so, as one rivalry stretches back into the NFL's deepest roots and another bursts forth into its brightest future, we see the cycle complete. Old grudges fuel new generations. New heartbreaks echo the pain of the past. And through it all, football becomes not just a sport, but a story told in rivalries, written in scars, and carried in memory forever. Rivalries. That's the word we've lived inside through this journey. The collisions of men, cities, histories, and legacies. But as we step back now, away from the roar of the crowd and the blur of highlight reels, what do these rivalries really mean? Why do they stay with us long after the games themselves fade into the haze of memory? At first glance, it might seem obvious. Rivalries make the games better. They give stakes to Sundays in November that might otherwise feel ordinary. They pack stadiums, sell jerseys, fuel debate shows, and light up social media. But the truth runs deeper. Rivalries endure because they tap into something primal, the human need to measure ourselves against an enemy, to define who we are by who we fight. Think back to the earliest ones we explored. Packers-Bears. It wasn't just football, it was about two cities, two identities, two ways of life. Chicago, industrial and sprawling. Green Bay, small town and stubborn. Each clash was a statement about belonging, about pride. That rivalry didn't just build teams. It built communities. It told people, this is who we are. Steelers-Ravens showed us the violence beneath the game. Those collisions weren't just tackles, they were declarations. Not in our house, not today, not against us. Giants-Eagles taught us that proximity breeds contempt, that sometimes hate grows not from difference, but from similarity. You don't despise strangers. You despise the neighbor who mirrors you too closely. Raiders-Chiefs revealed how a feud can survive generations, how bad blood can leap decades without losing potency. Washington-Cowboys reminded us that rivalries don't need balance to thrive. Sometimes hatred itself is the fuel. And then there are the modern ones, Chiefs-Bills, Bengals-Chiefs, even glimpses of a future still writing itself. They show us that rivalries are not relics. They are living things, evolving, reborn whenever two teams clash in ways that sear themselves into collective memory. The past gives them weight, but the present gives them fire. Yet behind all this, there is a deeper truth. Rivalries, for all their heat and hatred, are paradoxically what bind us together. Think of it. Cowboys fans despise Washington fans. Steelers fans loathe Ravens fans. Chiefs fans ache to silence Buffalo fans. But without each other, without the shared stage, the antagonist across the line of scrimmage, what are they? Rivalries are the strange glue that unites enemies in a single story. They give context to our passions. They make the victories sweeter, the losses harder, and the memories eternal. There's something almost mythic in that. Rivalries elevate football from mere competition into epic. When we speak of them, we don't just recall final scores, we recall sagas. The Immaculate Reception, the Fog Bowl, the Ice Bowl, the 13 seconds game. These moments are chapters, and rivalries are the novels that hold them. Without the rivalry, the chapter feels incomplete. With it, the moment becomes legend. And maybe that's why rivalries outlast dynasties. Teams rise, fall, rebuild, and sometimes vanish into irrelevance. Players age, retire, pass into memory. Coaches come and go, but rivalries endure. They are bigger than the men who play in them. They are carried forward like folklore, told from one generation to the next. A grandfather speaks of Staubach and Theismann. A father recalls Eichmann and Ripien. A son will grow up retelling Dak Prescott versus whoever takes Washington's helm next. The names change, but the hatred remains. That is legacy. That is immortality. Yet there's another paradox. For all the venom, rivalries often create respect. Ask Ray Lewis what he thought of Jerome Bettis. Ask Troy Aikman about Darryl Green. Ask Patrick Mahomes about Josh Allen. The fiercest enemies are often the first to embrace after the game. Because in the crucible of rivalry, you discover something about yourself. You learn your limits, your courage, your breaking points. And only an enemy worthy enough can teach you that. It's worth remembering, too, that rivalries often mirror the state of the league itself. In the 1970s, when defense ruled, rivalries like Steelers-Raiders flourished, defined by brutal hits and trench wars. In the 1980s, with offensive innovation rising, rivalries like 4-9 Erskine Boys gave us fireworks and dynastic clashes. Today, in the age of quarterbacks, Chiefs-Bills feels inevitable, because this era is defined by QBs who can do the impossible. Rivalries, then, are not just stories. They are snapshots of football itself, frozen in time. But what of us, the fans who live inside them? Rivalries are where loyalty is tested most. Anyone can support a team in victory. True allegiance is revealed in the pain of rivalry defeat, in the long off-season when that one loss still burns, in the decades of waiting for revenge that may never come, and when the moment of triumph finally arrives. When at last your team conquers the hated rival, it means more than any other victory. It feels eternal, even though we know the cycle will repeat again. That cycle is, in a way, the beauty of it. Rivalries never end. Even when one team dominates, hope lingers. Even when one side suffers decades of heartbreak, the chance of reversal never dies. That's what makes Buffalo cling to hope against Kansas City. That's what makes Washington circle their games against Dallas, no matter the standings. Rivalries remind us that in football, as in life, redemption is always possible. As we close, consider this. When future historians look back on the NFL, what will they remember most? The stats, the trophies, or the rivalries? I suspect it will be the rivalries, because they are not confined to record books. They live in memory, in scars, in stories passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. They live in stadium chants, in boos that echo decades, in cheers that shake concrete. They are not numbers, they are emotions, and emotions are what endure. That's why, in the end, rivalries are the NFL's greatest gift. They remind us that football is not just about winning, it's about belonging. Belonging to a city, to a community, to a story larger than ourselves. Rivalries give us heroes, villains, and the space between. They let us rage, cry, rejoice, despair. They turn a game into a saga, a Sunday into history. And so, as we leave behind Packers-Bears, Steelers-Ravens, Raiders-Chiefs, Cowboys-Washington, Chiefs-Bills, and all the others, we carry something with us. Not just knowledge of who won or who lost, but a deeper appreciation for why these battles matter. They matter because they tell us something about football. They matter because they tell us something about ourselves. In the end, rivalries are memory. Rivalries are legacy. Rivalries are forever.